Okay, a very good morning to everybody and welcome to day 3 of the conference. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. My name is Francis Neat and I'm new to GCFI. And I'm coming from Sweden and the Global Ocean Institute, which is a part of the World Maritime University. And I guess you might well be wondering what on earth has Sweden got to do with the Gulf and the Caribbean? But the World Maritime University is a UN institution, and we see ourselves as a centre of excellence for maritime and ocean postgraduate education, research, and in particular, global capacity building. And in recent years, we've been very pleased to partner with Hazel Oxenford, who you all know very well, from Surmays at the University of the West Indies in Barbados, as part of a major research project that started in 2020. It's a project called Closing the Circle, and marine debris, sargassum, and marine spatial planning in the Eastern Caribbean. The project's funded by the Nippon Foundation, and it supports PhD students and researchers from across the Caribbean region. We have PhD students from the Bahamas, from the Grenada, Antigua, Barbuda, Trinidad and Tobago, and of course, Barbados. And one of the research areas of the project is the Sargassum inundations that the region has been experiencing for the past decade or so. We wanted to bring together the experts who are at the forefront of tackling this complex socio-ecological problem. And GCFI really provided the perfect forum to do this. And we're really very pleased to bring this special session, which we called Living with Sargassum, Current Scientific Perspectives and Future Outlook for Fisheries, Coastal Managers and Entrepreneurs. There we go. We've got a very exciting and varied lineup of talks this morning, most of them in person and some of them virtual. I'm going to be your moderator for the first session this morning, and then I'm going to pass on to Hazel to chair the following section after the break. Hazel, would you like to say a quick word or two?
I'd like just to welcome everybody here and everybody who's online. It's a great honor to be co-hosting this event on Sargassum, and a huge issue for all of us within the insular Caribbean. So thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. So it really gives me great pleasure then to move straight into the proceedings and introduce our keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Shelley-Ann Cox, who's from Barbados. Shelley-Ann is an ocean professional with over 10 years of experience in fisheries management and sargassum management and governance. She's also done a lot of work on applied sort of interdisciplinary climate-related research in the ocean realm. She holds a PhD from Surmays, and she continued on to work at Surmays as a postdoctoral research associate with Hazel, and really established herself as one of the leading experts in sargassum in the world. She also established her own consultancy firm at the time, and it's great to know that Shelley-Ann is actually going to go forward and now take on the position of Chief Fisheries Officer for Barbados. As I said, she's really a world authority in sargassum, and she's been involved in co-authoring several of the most significant publications recently, including the UNEP Caribbean Environment Programme 2021 Sargassum White Paper and the Sargassum Uses Guide. So I think we can now move across to Shelley's presentation, and I'd really like to have a warm round of applause for Shelley to take the floor, please. So just point in that direction and it works.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's great, having Hazel as a mentor, and someone to aspire to be. This morning, for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to present current scientific perspectives and a future outlook, really, not only for fisheries, but most of the socioeconomic sectors, as well as entrepreneurs, coastal managers. But I've really entitled it Transatlantic Triple Threat. And we'll see why I've referred to sargassum influxes as the triple T. But before I do my presentation this morning, I had the great opportunity to work with a very talented Bajan poet, Cindy Celeste. And in the next 4 minutes, we're going to present the sargassum story to provide a background and context. I think that maybe even after the poem, I wouldn't have to do much talking, although to highlight some of the amazing work that has been done so far on sargassum, a lot of you in the room as well, contributing to this body of knowledge. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this poem entitled Heads or Tails, 2 options for perception.
Since 2011, the waves have been washing in, a new game for us to play. The tide rolls in with a choice to make, riding on its coattails. The details are simple. 2 options for perception, 2 sides of the same single coin to choose from, and the familiar question, heads or tails? On one side, let's call this side tails. The sea sends in sargassum as the brown tide. This maritime menace migrates across the Atlantic, a pelagic
Yeah, sorry about that.
trouble it has in store, forged by climate change and fertilized by nutrient single coin to choose a new game for us to play. Since 2011, the waves have been washing in, a new game for us to play. The tide rolls in with a choice to make, riding on its coattails. The details are simple. 2 options for perception, 2 sides of the same single coin to choose from, and the familiar question, heads or tails? On one side, let's call this side tails. The sea sends in sargassum as the brown tide. This maritime menace migrates across the Atlantic, a pelagic passenger riding waves to make its way to our shores with whatever trouble it has in store, forged by climate change and fertilized by nutrients into rich growth. And its mischief won't just stop at the coast. Although golden sanded beaches are much easier to market than the stench of souring seaweed. But you see, sargassum doesn't just create a cosmetic problem. In fact, following our current trend, it is a triple threat to a fragile ecosystem. How the fishermen see less and less of the fish species, their local markets like the best, and the dayboat captain, whose vessels will have to circumvent the seaweed maze, lest their craft fall prey to a damaged propeller or a rudder's inner workings ripped asunder. Consider those living close to the coastline, when the air around them is infused not only with brine, but also with ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, whose health will suffer over time from prolonged exposure. And the inland population might not escape either. If the sweat of sargassum seeps into the groundwater, how it can become a showstopper, destabilizing a desalination plant in St. Croix to halt the production of water, or creeping into a Puerto Rican plant to cut off the power. And if we want to talk cents and dollars, instead of thinking about foreign exchange from overseas adventurers, perhaps cleanup costs are the big line items we should have more care for. The coin is up in the air. And if tails isn't sounding so good, then have no fear, because there's another side for you to mull over. One where trash could turn itself into treasure, where filth can be made into fuel or fertilizer, where masses of sargassum can be made into medicine. Let's call this side heads, where a menace can be made a muse, instead used to inspire innovation and industry. And if you don't believe me, then I'd show you the people taking advantage of the nascent possibilities, the ingenious making sargassum supplements to feed their livestock, or turning the tons coming piled high into building blocks. the ones trying to add their seaweed stock to sustainable markets already on the rise, like bioenergy, like biodegradables, like the types of enterprise that could take a scourge and realize that they have the power to turn the brown tide into a golden jewel. This side is daring you to overcome the difficulties, to look at the challenges and decide to wade through uncertain seas, because although it may sound better, that doesn't mean it's easy. Supply may vastly vary from one year to the next. There will be challenges to overcome, to harvest and process. Progress will require deep research and all hands on deck, because for all we know, sargassum could be Pandora's box dressed like a treasure chest. But even when constraints test your patience, the important thing will be the strength of your will to make a difference. This is a trial of ingenuity and resilience. So what is your preference? Heads or tails?
Heads or tails, two options for perception. Transatlantic triple threat. Sargassum in fluxes, a hazard, an opportunity, heads or tails. This would be more or less the frame of the presentation this morning, providing these current science perspectives and future outlook. And the presentation this morning will be kind of designed along the transatlantic triple threat timeline, where of course we know back in 2011, we were scrambling for answers. Sometimes we didn't have a clue. Back in Barbados, we thought it was a different type of species, of course, before we knew what it really was. Till today, where we're seeing, moonshot ideas, things that we would never have thought about back in 2011. So I'm going to take you along this timeline this morning, providing, of course, a quick overview, especially on the monitoring and the forecasting aspects, as well as the literature and the body of knowledge. So the causal pathway. I know I'm preaching to the converted here in terms of what's the new source of sargassum, so we don't need to go very detailed into that. And we have a lot of speakers this morning speaking on different aspects. But just to say that we know the causal pathway for sargassum is, it existed elsewhere. It came to the new source, it proliferated, and then it is transported to the Caribbean and West Africa. And of course, depicted here is some of the reasons for its proliferation, from sea surface temperatures increasing to African dust. All of our scientific leaders have documented these specific causes, but yet the conversation continues. It's not just one cause, it's several factors contributing to the problem. So we continue along this causal pathway to look and see what other symptoms of climate change contribute to the cause. And these changing currents that are bringing the sargassum to the Caribbean and West Africa. But how are we responding? How are we adapting? We're seeing coping strategies in coastal communities. We're also seeing adaptation options. Mitigation, of course, is still nascent in terms of you see mitigation strategies to address impacts, but the mitigation of the problem itself is still a nascent possibility. But we're going to, speak more to some of these responses, the research response as well, as we continue along. So how do we frame a strategic framework then to address the problem? Looking at adaptation, mitigation, and policy development and coordination. And this, of course, is an extract from the Sargassum 2021 white paper, where we attempted then to structure a strategic response and then align it with the blue economy links as well in the column on the right. So you can see, we've seen some discussion around, how blue carbon fits into it, how the development of barriers as well could support blue economy, development and innovation, and then policy development and coordination. At the regional level, of course, we've seen some initiatives, the CRFM model protocol for addressing sargassum, for instance, but yet it's still up to the countries themselves to take this guidance and adapt it to the local context. So we're seeing some progression there, but of course, there are some countries that still don't have a sargassum management plan, for instance. So just that very overarching overview of what the response needs to be. All right, so now we go to tails, the hazard. And just a summary, the triple threat, of course, is impacting the social, the economic, and the environmental. And we have, of course, all agreed that negative impacts are multi-sectoral. In the beginning, we were always speaking towards fisheries and tourism, but we're seeing now even emerging impacts in the energy and water sectors, for instance. So just, a brief overview. Professor Hilary Beckles, our Pro Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, had described sargassum as the greatest single threat to the Caribbean's tourism industry, where we've seen some huge impacts. This picture here was taken by a hotelier, Paul Doyle, in Barbados, one of our beaches that was rated the top 10 in the world. And imagine, his shock when he woke up to see something like this back in 2018. The same year, Barbados declared a state of emergency. But something like this, of course, really leads and gives insight to the amount of cleaning costs that tourism and hoteliers and other businesses had to invest back in 2018. And there was an estimate of 120 million. Fisheries, of course, significant impacts to the fisheries sector. We saw sargassum clogging fishing gear, entanglement of engines overheating, even hindering access to jetties. And some of the impacts, of course, to the fishery sector are documented. CERNI's leading with a lot of that work in documenting the impact. And then the environment. We've seen nesting turtles being impacted with, the sargassum beaching on the shore, hatchlings having difficulty returning to the sea. Should I say going to the sea for the first time, actually, the hatchlings. And then, of course, the impact on coral reefs, seagrass beds, mangroves. And sometimes, we don't really know the extent of that impact because we're right in it, just 11 years. And then coastal living. These people can't leave. They live on the coast. They're exposed to the ammonia and the hydrogen sulfide. Some reporting respiratory illnesses. Persons also reporting skin irritations, damage to their electronics, for example, and very heavily impacted, even in terms of public health and the impacts. Sydney described it as, sargassum seeping into the groundwater. And, persons, community residents that live along the coast are experiencing this poor air quality, and it's impacting their lives. And energy, that was last year, October, there was a report in Puerto Rico that the sargassum got into the intake pipes and resulted in a power outage. And this year, the state of emergency called in the US Virgin Islands, in St. Croix specifically, where the desalination plant was affected, impacting on the water production. So significant impacts across all sectors. So what's our response like? We've seen the development of several early warning systems. For instance, we know one of the most popular ones led by Dr. Hugh and his team at USF, the Sargassum Watch System. We've seen our partners in France, CLS, developing the SAM tool. And then, other systems would use the products, even if they're open access or private. There's Caracus in Puerto Rico, for example, CIMAR used by our Mexican colleagues, and then NOAA as well, also developing monitoring systems. just, a zoom in on Sargassum watch system. Of course, I submitted my presentation close to time, so I don't have today's image. But this is October 30th. And then SAMDUL does publish a weekly image, although access is restricted, but now they have successfully received a grant and they're hoping to open SAMDUL again free of charge for those persons interested. But you see that their photo would provide a wider view, and there's some sargassum off West Africa that might reach our shores in a few months. So these are some of the operational tools that we've used. Of course, we've taken it a step further to take the early warning information and package it and tailor it to our context. We've seen the production of weekly sargassum inundation reports led by NOAA AOML, Meteo France, and the CLS collaboration, releasing weekly bulletins from Martinique and Guadeloupe. Our Sargassum, some regional outlook bulletin that CERMES leads in terms of a bi-monthly 3-month and an experimental 6-month forecast. Our collaboration, of course, with USM continues as we try to validate the forecast, as well as looking at the implications for what it was for several sectors. We did fisheries and tourism for a long time, but now we've included environment. And then USF does package their products in a 1-pager every month in terms of what they're seeing now and what they expect to see in a 3-month basis. Monitoring systems. So USM, for example, they were the first out with a monitoring system for citizen science and citizens, which apparently is a new terminology for citizen science in the ocean space. Being able to report sargassum influxes, provide photos. And then, of course, from then we started to see apps and other monitoring systems where people could upload their information. This is very valuable for forecasting and ground truthing, of course. So we see the importance of the development of these types of tools. And of course, we started to see some young entrepreneurs need this app in Antigua, for example, which tried to have, an early warning type system, mobile app for a small island context. Droning the protocols, I just highlighted it before, but the monitoring protocols that have been developed by CERMES, from the drone monitoring protocol, biodiversity, species, and beach transit method. These are all available on the internet, as well as can be accessed from the Sargassum Hub. And speaking of the Sargassum Hub as the clearinghouse for all information related to pelagic sargassum, we know that there are several information sources across several websites. And I myself try to scour these things to keep my ears to the ground, but we all know the importance of centralizing information. And the Sargassum Information Hub, led by GeoPluPlanet, is that clearinghouse. And of course, we have to do a bit more work to improve and include other sources, but it is in a pretty good state that you can visit the website and get the information. So that's, the URL, sargassum.org, and then you can see the several persons, organizations contributing to making sure that the hub is updated. We've seen SARGNet, a very important network for sargassum, about 528 individuals on the network now, sharing information on the latest journal articles, webinars, events, quite useful. And I would recommend those persons who are interested in this issue to subscribe to it. SPARAC as well also developed an online forum for sharing information. And the Sargassum podcast, which I believe is up to 53 episodes, is also a good information source. They have interviewed not only scientists and researchers, but fisher folk. There are some entrepreneurs, startups as well, who have been interviewed by the podcast hosts, so quite useful. And of course, webinars, symposia, and conferences. So there is a page on the Sargassum Hub that keeps the information up to date of all of the upcoming webinars so that you can keep updated. And then when we get into science communication, there are so many bulletins, brochures, booklets that have been developed over the years. Here's an attempt at some of the, the most widely used GCFI as well, with their really good poster to address what we were seeing with all of the heavy machinery being used, but good practices, of course, for removing sargassum. And even, out of the Caribbean Environment Program, the white paper, the associated summary briefs, SERMIs with their FAO, Sargassum Management Policy Brief as well, the foresight brief that accompanied the white paper are really good communication products that summarize the issue itself, but also provides solutions and, of course, a strategic direction for addressing influxes. And then we have the Sargassum Reference Repository, which is a powerful tool and platform where there are, I guess, over 400 pieces of literature in there, not only journal articles, but of course, some great literature. It is the one-stop shop. If you are a researcher looking into different areas, and I attempted to try to get all the keywords in this word cloud to look at the body of knowledge of sargassum is quite diverse. You see chemical composition, different things about marker types, from monitoring to forecasting. There's so much out there and so much being produced on a monthly basis, but the reference repository is a good resource for our one-stop shop. So looking at the mainstreaming aspects, then we've covered monitoring, forecasting, science communication, information products, tools, and platforms. But what about the mainstreaming of sargassum management in existing blue economy frameworks? At the regional level, what is the policy development? So we've seen the integration, we've seen the drafting of national management plans, SERMIs leading the development of sargassum adaptive management strategies for Eastern Caribbean countries. We've seen great examples of sargassum task force, innovative institutional type arrangements. Belize, of course, leading with one of the more active task force. And then sargassum management committees in different islands, for instance, and then developing regional policy. The Caribbean heads of government back in 2015 raised sargassum as an important issue that needed a collaborative effort to address. We saw in the same year, UNEP and the General Assembly as well. And then the development of the white papers in 2018 and 2021. And of course, the development of the Caribbean program that we affectionately call SARCOOP, actually headquarters in Guadeloupe. This was signed in 2018 at the International Conference on Sargassum. So we're starting to see some movement towards, developing regional policy. Of course, there are still some gaps. And, how we looked at not only the negative impacts on the blue economy, but, looking at opportunities in rewards, renewable energy product innovation and blue carbon. So now we get to the side heads. And of course, I use a Barbados coin because a fish is featured. And you see, of course, the importance of fisheries in Barbados. I mean, it's on our dollar coin, it's part of our national identity. And on this side, heads, we will view sargassum in fluxes as sargassum-kissed shores, a catalyst for innovation. I love this picture. This is actually my friend's kid's hand. You know, it shows the opportunity, the next generation looking to use sargassum because by then they would have found a way to clean up all the tons of sargassum, we hope. But looking at how do we go about developing innovative harvesting equipment, sustainable sargassum value chains, the innovation in terms of institutional arrangements I spoke about a little before, and then it as a muse for artistic pursuits, the sargassum, this poem this morning, being inspired by the problem. And even looking at some other things, I mean, Boss Papi out of Guadeloupe, his sargassum music video is quite impactful. We've seen sargassum paper art, others in Guadeloupe and Martinique with their installation, Homo Sargasso. And then, of course, the oils and paintings, abstract designs, there is, inspiration from the influxes and is being seen in our the work by our Caribbean artists. Sargassum opportunities, the uses guide does document a multiplicity of uses. We also try to include several case studies of persons that were working on the development of other uses. In terms of our interviews with these same entrepreneurs, we asked them what they could do with 1 ton of fresh sargassum. And we can see that, it can make sargassum blocks, for instance, looking at sheep feed. Some people were doing coasters and papers. This is, some of the examples, but the possibilities are endless. I mean, part of, developing the guide, we were very interested in the activated carbon and that potential for the use of sargassum. And, since we would have published the uses guide in 2020, there are so many more entrepreneurs and startups looking at developing uses. I believe Phyconomy and their database on Airtable is one of the best updates on, and I believe they have about 52 entries on who is working on sargassum uses and products and services in the region, and even outside the region, I should say. And then, we will want to work on updating what West Africa is doing in terms of valorization initiatives. So this really fed into our thinking, okay, developing sargassum uses, but we really need to have it address using a value chain lens, thinking about what resources would be required at every step along the value chain, from harvest, to the marketing and distribution of products and services. And of course, there are cross-cutting activities across these different parts of the chain. When you think about research and development, for instance, and keeping a handle on the quality across these different harvests, post-harvest, or even the processing, and processing itself has several multiple steps. And sometimes, there might be transportation between more or less of this. This sargassum value chain is quite generic, but it will look differently for different products and services. So then, thinking again, how then could we integrate digital technologies to make sure that this process of developing sustainable sargassum value chains is efficient? And then thinking about, the types of technologies that could be used, from the harvesting of it. We're seeing persons developing prototypes for autonomous aqua drones. This is a Mexican-Norwegian collaboration. We've seen drones, of course, being used in terms of monitoring, and these are the flying drones. Persons attempting to use underwater cameras and drones as well. Of course, part of it is the integration of artificial intelligence and deep machine learning to help with the analytics of it. And even in the processing component, the top left is an X-ray spectrometer being used in a sargassum storage site in Guadeloupe, and it could do in situ arsenic measures. So lots of different technology being used as well, even as it relates to the air quality monitoring. You see here illustrated in the bottom left, instrumentation powered by solar as well. And then it has, of course, a real-time portal to show what the levels are. And if the levels exceed what is expected, then there are alerts that go out to coastal communities. Dr. Legina Henry and her team at the University of West Indies in Cave Hill have started a kickoff startup called Rum and Sargassum Inc., where they're looking at sargassum, rum water, wastewater, as well as manure from black belly sheep to develop a biocompressed natural gas. And there, of course, are looking to upscale the development of the liquid CNG, but they have a website, that documents the solution and the opportunity to invest in that specific innovation. And then we get to the moonshot ideas, and I have been trying to keep tabs on 3 of them specifically. So we have the algal ray being promoted by the sargassum seaweed generation. And of course, it comes with the concept of scooping up sargassum and sinking it to the deep. And of course, we tend to have some reservations about the impacts to the deep sea as well. But this algal ray has received quite a substantial amount of funding to explore the development of these devices. And then there is sea fields. Sea fields, they are looking, of course, at developing seaweed farms out to sea. And their concept is to roll the sargassum, bale it and sink it as well. And through that means then develop, blue carbon trading and a market from that specific innovation. Of course, there are, in the initial steps, but they already have received some funding to support that. And they've started some initial experiments. And then swag, we know swag, we got the swag from GCFI, the nice bag, but now it means something different. It means sargassum and wood to develop aviation fuel and graphite. And they have received quite a bit of funding as well to explore this. So these are some of the moonshot ideas that, are in motion. And of course, we're keeping tabs to see how the development of these go. But as we rightfully said earlier, there are still a lot of constraints and challenges that will hinder the development of some of these ideas. Unpredictable supply, chemical composition, the harvesting, transport, and storage, that still remains difficult. Management and regulations, and of course, the last one, insufficient funding and support. But somehow some of these moonshot ideas are attracting a lot of funding. And in other cases, we can't get funding for things that are quite impactful for coastal communities. So this is some of the reflections I've been having recently when reading, the press releases on some of these big moonshot ideas. But the future outlook still looks bright, although we still have a lot to do in terms of the harvesting and the collection and figuring out, in terms of innovating, if offshore harvesting is indeed the best option, and what research we need to do that to make sure that the organisms that live in there aren't significantly impacted. But some of my thoughts on, the outlook. I've seen the development of the sargassum art and how can we use non-fungible tokens to help artists, of course, market their sargassum related art. We're looking at how blockchain, for example, can be used to support the marketing of blue carbon. And then where do we see collaborations with tech startups in the region with researchers? I think we will have to collaborate with them going forward if we really want to address the influx in an innovative way. So my last slide, and this is the last verse of the poem. We are the culmination of a transatlantic crossing. So if anything, we are the ones who know how to make the best thing out of inconvenience, are the ones who know what it is to overcome. So I'll repeat the golden question: heads or tails? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Please stay. I think we have time for a couple of questions, and I'm sure there must be a few questions out there. I see one immediately, please.
Hi, good morning, great talk. Quick question about the size of the different countries. I'm wondering if you think there's a difference in the solution and in the problems between, let's say, Barbados and Jamaica, you know, just very different size and economies and the scale and all that. If you could talk to that.
Yes, so thanks for your question. And yes, I mean, you know, CERMES has started trying to address hazard and exposure data, even trying to look at the specific inundation sites and even the type of bays, geological features, all of that kinds of way in terms of the solutions, where you can use offshore barriers, for instance, and DR, and they work quite well, but our attempt in Barbados, because we're at the Atlantic, Paul Doyle from Crane attempted using some barriers, and of course, it wasn't fit for purpose. Lots needed to be done in terms of the anchoring system and other things. So you're right, skills as well would be quite important. And then Jamaica, that has a large manufacturing sector that can retrofit to use Sargassum, versus us in Barbados that wouldn't have that type of industrial structure. You know, more solutions need to be tailored, and not even a country to country, even site to site. You have to, you know, use the information and work with the local stakeholders to design interventions to suit.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do we have one more, please?
Hi, thank you, Shelley, for great work you're doing. I wanted to find out from you about do you have examples in Barbados with it being used commercially in agriculture, growing products like that?
Okay, we had a young entrepreneur producing a plant biotonic, and this is Joshua Fort with his red diamond. So that is, you know, using in agriculture. We also had the development of the National Conservation attempted some compost. I don't know the, you know, update on that specifically recently, but there was attempts. Of course, we need to caution the heavy metal content of persons working towards trying to remove the heavy metals before they develop the developing processes for agriculture type related innovations. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think actually, because we're a little bit behind time, Shelley's going to be around all of today. So certainly the opportunities to catch her at the coffee break and such like, but just like to thank her for a wonderful, comprehensive and very clear talk. Thank you very much, Shelley.
Thank you.
So next on our lineup, I'm delighted to ask Christy Elaine to come up. Christy is a PhD student at the World Maritime University in conjunction with CERMES. It's actually myself and Hazel, her supervisors. And Christy spent the last year or more out in the field collecting samples of sargassum. And this is really the first chance she's had to present her work to a big audience. So Christy, the title of your talk is a spatiotemporal analysis of sargassum impacting the Eastern Caribbean, morphotypes and suborigins, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christy Allen, as Francis said, and this morning I will be presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Donald Johnson, Francis Neat, Hazel Oxenford, and Henri Valles. This presentation is entitled A Spatiotemporal Analysis of Sargassum Impacting the Eastern Caribbean, Morphotypes and Suborigins. Here we highlight the key findings of a paper that is currently under review. Given the amazing keynote address we just received, thank you, Shelley. I won't waste any time explaining the impacts to the region. However, to provide some context for our study, I want to highlight 4 main points. Sargassum affecting the region generally consists of 3 commonly occurring morphotypes. These are Sargassum natans 1, Sargassum natans 8, and Sargassum fluidans 3. There is substantial interannual and intra-annual variation in these morphotypes during influx events. Initial influxes were comprised of Sargassum fluidans 3 and natans 8, but more recent observations show Sargassum fluidans 3 and natans 1. And to date, the variability in the relative composition of these morphotypes originating from the North Equatorial Recirculating region remains poorly understood. This photo shows the 3 morphotypes we assess. On the left, we have Sargassum natans 1. In the center is Sargassum natans 8. And to the right, we have Sargassum fluidans 3. To address the uncertainties surrounding the supply of the 3 commonly identified morphotypes, we were aiming to address 2 main questions. The first being, how does the relative composition of Sargassum morphotypes within MAX vary over time? And secondly, is this variation between these morphotypes linked to suborigins within the NEAR? I will be interchanging NEAR and the North Equatorial Recirculating region. It's the same thing. Our study was conducted in Barbados on the Morgan Lewis Beach, which is located on the east coast of the island. During collection, 3 clumps of newly beached wet sargassum were collected approximately 10-meter intervals from each other along the shoreline, and clumps were separated into these 3 morphotypes based on morphological characteristics, and all collection days were backtracked. For backtracks, the study used a compiled file from the Global Drifter Program dataset consisting of year, day, hour, longitude, latitude, west current, and east current. This was from 1979 to 2020 using a simple backtracking algorithm with 0.5% windage. Sargassum tracks were backtracked over 365 days from our collection points on the beach to determine the origin of each sample within the NEAR. Backtracks were simulated using 100 particles launched simultaneously from the sample locations. The tracking methodology that we use is the same methodology used to obtain the 3-month sargassum forecast for the Lesser Antilles, which is published in the Sargassum Sub-Regional Outlook Bulletin that Shelley Ann spoke on earlier. Collections were made over a 1-year period running from 2021 to 2022. Looking at the overall composition of our data, we see that S. fluidans 3 was the predominant morphotype. Our results align with recent studies from Jamaica, which also looked at morphotype composition, and they found fluidans 3 during the summer as their main morphotype, but it wasn't aligning with earlier studies from 2015, which found Sargassum natans 8 as their dominant morphotype. Monthly analysis of the relative abundance of the 3 morphotypes revealed temporal differences in the predominant morphotype species. While fluidans 3 was the predominant morphotype overall in 80% of our samples, January and November showed a marked change in the predominant form from the previously dominant Sargassum fluidans 3 to the previously rare Sargassum natans 8. Over the 1-year period, changes in the relative abundance seem to indicate two overlapping periods. And we have the first being between like February and October, where we see a clear dominance of Sargassum fluidans 3. And on the other hand, we had a second period which points to increasing abundance of Sargassum natans 8 with decreasing quantities of Sargassum fluidans 3 and SN1. We then tried to link our results to the NEAR, and we found that backtracks reveal two distinct suborigins or transport pathways within the NEAR. Going forward, I would just say suborigins. Sargassum stranded in Barbados between March and early August apparently originated close to the equator and traveled along northeast Brazil before arriving in Barbados. And we refer to this as suborigin A. On the other hand, Sargassum arriving between late August and February originated further north and traveled a relatively direct route to Barbados, and we refer to this as suborigin B. Backtracks associated with origin A showed higher average distance travel, ranging from 5,740 kilometers to 8,550 kilometers over the 365-day period. In contrast, backtracks originating from suborigin B traveled relatively far north, like 9 to 18 degrees north, and traveled a more direct westerly route, covering a much shorter distance over the 365 days. These distances range between 4,080 kilometers and 4,870 kilometers. The relative abundance of Sargassum natans 1, natans 8, and fluidans 3 differed significantly between these two origins. Origin A, which was between March to early August, showed a predominance of Sargassum fluidans 3. And origin B, which is late August to February, showed higher levels of Sargassum natans 8 with reduced quantities of fluidans 3. So we identify these two suborigins, and we know that they have different morphotype compositions. But why are they different? We then try to link this we then try to identify differences between the two areas that we found to identify why are we seeing different relative compositions. And we investigated whether sea surface temperatures and nutrient load differed between our two areas. Analysis showed that differing sea surface temperatures within suborigins influence the morphotype composition arriving in Barbados. S fluidans 3 dominating mass arriving from the southerly transport pathway close to the equator traverse higher sea surface temperatures when compared to the northerly transport pathway B. High variability in chlorophyll within each of these two suborigins prevented a clear understanding of the possible differences between them and the effect of nutrient availability on morphotype composition. However, recent studies indicate that sargassum blooms are enhanced by nitrogen-rich waters, and nutrient availability is a key driver of sargassum variability. Studies on growth and mortality of the three morphotypes in various conditions are required to understand their optimal conditions and the effects of dispersal routes on the morphotype compositions that we receive. So what does this mean? The identification of two suborigins or transport pathways can play a critical role in advancing the region's understanding of factors responsible for the continued proliferation and extensive interannual variability of sargassum across the tropical Atlantic since its first initial bloom in 2011. Furthermore, previous studies have highlighted the variation in the supply of these three morphotypes as a valorization constraint. And this is because these morphotypes have different element compositions, making them more or less suited for certain applications. So Shelley spoke on 5 challenges earlier, and the supply in morphotype was one of them. We can use sargassum, and the uses for each of the morphotypes vary, so the relative composition of each incoming mat can change what you can and cannot do with any influx event. And interestingly, these morphotypes also support different faunal communities, with S fluidans 3 hosting larger and more diverse assemblage compared to SN Sargassum natans 1 and 8, which can potentially have implications for harvesting. As Shelley also mentioned, there's a vast biodiversity associated with these mats. And these are things that we need to be aware of when we're going to be managing these influx events, especially with in-water harvesting as a strategy. The findings of our study are therefore relevant to the developing sargassum industry by providing guidance to entrepreneurs on the morphotypes they are likely to encounter at different times of the year, and by extension, help to address valorization constraints surrounding the variation in the supply of the 3 prevalent morphotypes. I wish to thank the Nippon Foundation of Japan for funding this research, and I would also like to extend my gratitude to Makeda Corbin, Michaela Small, and Amy Cox for helping with the collection and sorting of samples. And for anyone who's interested in the collection and separation protocol, I encourage you to take a look at our sargassum monitoring protocol for species, where we detail steps used to collect, identify, analyze these 3 morphotypes. And finally, I've also provided the link to our link tree where you can, sorry, he's taking a photo. I've also provided the link to our link tree where you can see all of our CERME's ongoing projects and learn more about who we are, what we do, access all of our monitoring plans, including the species one and some of the drone ones, which my colleagues will speak to, and dive into some of our sargassum story maps. If I say they're amazing, you can tell for yourself. But this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Christy. Perfectly on time. And I'm sure there might be a question or two among the audience. Yep, please.
Great talk, thank you. I had a question if there were any studies done at the origin by Africa and the composition, if it's similar over there to once it reaches Barbados.
That's a very good question, because this work that we did to identify these 2 regions are like very, very recent. And there's only one paper which leads us to the punchline of like identifying these 2 regions. And this is where we need to be, because we now know there are 2 separate regions that are producing these different morphotypes. And like, why are they, right? So now we need to figure out what are the conditions among these. And that's what we were trying to do with the chlorophyll data and the sea surface temperature data, but it was satellite driven and it wasn't like quite right. So we still have to do further studies into it, but hopefully that's where we're going. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks interesting, like if it's the same species that start and end, or if different ones survive the journey. And then
as they travel along the way and conditions change, because each of these morphotypes they have like different optimal growth. And I don't want to talk on growth because my colleague Makeda will be talking on growth, but they have different requirements. And based on those requirements, as they travel, it may change along the way. And that's very interesting. Yeah.
very cool. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Do we have a further question? Yeah, we have one.
Excellent talk. Thanks very much. Where I live, we don't have this problem yet, but the clock's ticking, so we'll see what might develop. But I'm curious about mat size. You had an illustration, 2 different tracks coming from West Africa to the Caribbean and to South America. And I'm curious, has anyone done aerial measurement, AREAL measurements of the size of these mats that come across?
Well, I didn't do it in this study, but mats differ in size, and Michaela Small will be talking about the quantities that we receive on the beach and track, and what we model coming in versus what we actually collect on shore, to give an idea of the quantities that we receive. But I have not looked at measuring the amount of sargassum.
Okay, I'm just looking at fish transport mechanisms, and this seems to be an extremely interesting problem.
Definitely.
All right, thanks.
Of course. Thank you.
Great, thanks for the question. Do we have any further? I think we've got time for one quick one. If not, thank you very much, Christy. Wonderful presentation, and we'll move on to the next. So I'd like now to ask, in some ways, Christy's partner in crime to come forward, and they've been working very much together, undertaking field work and collaborating very nicely. Makeda Corbin, she's undertaking her master's at CERME's, and this is, again, for her, the first time she gets to present her research. Makeda, please.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. As Francis mentioned, my name is Makeda Corbin, and I'm currently an MPhil student at CERME's. And today I'll be presenting my topic, which I would have worked on with my supervisor, Professor Oxenford. And it's entitled, of course, Answering the Golden Question: How fast does pelagic sargassum grow in the tropical Atlantic? Right, so as Christy has already touched on a few aspects of sargassum that are also pertinent to my research, I'll just reiterate a few key points and perhaps just delve in a little bit more. So as you mentioned, between the two species composing sargassum rafts, there are three commonly occurring morphotypes, a single S. fluitans morphotype and two S. natans morphotypes, S. natans 1 and S. natans 8. These last two, of course, are of the same species, so they are indeed conspecifics. However, all three morphotypes are indeed morphologically and genetically distinct from each other. So both spatial and temporal trends in relative abundance of these morphotypes have been observed, as Christy mentioned. And historically, sargassum occurred in the Sargasso Sea of the North Atlantic. And since 2011, it has been abundantly prevalent in the new region, the near and the tropical Atlantic. Now, the Sargasso Sea, S. natans 1 is pretty much the consistent predominant morphotype. However, in the near tropical Atlantic, there have been shifts in dominance from S. natans 8 to S. fluitans 3. Furthermore, there's also temporal variability in the total biomass of sargassum being transported from the near. For example, in July 2016, approximately 2 million tons of sargassum were transported from the near, compared to approximately 17 million tons in 2018. Now we expect that various biotic and abiotic factors are interacting and contributing some capacity to driving these trends. And one of those factors is believed to be the growth rates of these three morphotypes under different environmental conditions. So that has led to a few questions. One, how quickly does sargassum grow in the tropical Atlantic? There are indeed a few growth studies in published literature, but there are few. And these studies solely focus on North Atlantic sargassum populations under local conditions. Thus, there are currently no growth data for the near sargassum populations under their respective local conditions. Also, is there a difference in the growth between these morphotypes? Once again, these are a few studies, they only compare the growth of S. fluitans 3 and S. natans 1. And the conclusions between these studies are a bit inconsistent. And furthermore, there's currently no growth data for S. natans 8, which historically was an extremely uncommon morphotype in the North Atlantic. So why do I seek to answer these questions? Why is answering these questions important? This is because answering these questions is going to have important implications for the improvement of forecast models, much like weather forecasts. As Shadi mentioned earlier, these forecast models, such as the Outlook Bulletin produced by Sermes, predict the arrival and the intensity of sargassum influxes, and they're a very, very important management tool. And the inclusion of growth data can actually help to increase the accuracy of these forecast predictions. Thus, in the present study, I sought to investigate the growth of the three sargassum morphotypes from the tropical Atlantic near under ambient conditions. So this study was conducted in nearshore waters of Barbados in the Eastern Caribbean. And this is an ideal study location, not just because I live there, but because Barbados is actually one of the first islands to receive sargassum as it is transported from the near into the Caribbean Sea. Right. So to monitor the growth of sargassum in situ, I required a system that would effectively contain the sargassum while allowing the sargassum to still be exposed to the environment. So to achieve this, I used what I termed growth mesocosms. And these were just constructed out of 5-liter clear plastic bottles with multiple perforations along the surface. This would encourage water flow to the sargassum. And also at the ends, you would see I put some floats to just keep it buoyant, helping the sargassum to maintain its natural position in the water column, because as you know, it does float on the surface. 3 mesocosms were joined to form a triplicate set, and I used 2 triplicate sets to hold a maximum of 6 replicates for each morphotype. And these were then secured to a mooring buoy, as you can see in my little drawing to the side. All right, so for this study, the study was conducted over 2 periods. I had a cool period, where temperatures are a cool period and a warm period. During the cool period, temperatures range from 27 to 28 degrees Celsius. It might not sound that cool, but in the Caribbean, that is cool. And salinity range from 30 to 34 parts per thousand. And during the warm period, temperatures range from 29 to 30 degrees Celsius, salinity ranging from 31 to 33 parts per thousand. During each study period, the study period was 3 weeks long, and I used 3 6-day trials were conducted for each study period. So at the start of each trial, fresh morphotype replicates were collected and they were weighed before being placed into the mesocosms and into the water to grow for those 6 days. And at the end, I removed them, reweighed them, and discarded them. Right, so the in situ studies revealed a significant difference in the growth rates between the 3 sargassum morphotypes. During the cool period, sargassum fluitans was, the growth of sargassum fluitans was significantly higher compared to both S. natans 1 and S. natans 8. And S. natans 1 also grew significantly faster than its conspecific S. natans 8. During the warm period, S. fluitans growth remained significantly higher than both S. natans morphotypes. However, the growth of S. natans 1 and S. natans 8 during this period were actually statistically similar. Also, for each morphotype, I then use a t-test to just compare their growth during the cool period and the warm period. And between study periods, growth of S. fluitans was indeed higher during the cool period, where temperatures range from 27 to 28, and they dropped significantly during the warm period. However, growth of S. natans 1 and S. natans 8, the growth were statistically similar between both periods. All right, so pulling the data for both of those periods, just to get a look at the growth rates over the full temperature range from 27 to 30, the results once again showed similar trends to the cool period, where we again see a decreasing trend in morphotype growth rates from S. fluitans 3 down to S. natans 8. So the answer to the golden question, how quickly does sargassum grow in the tropical Atlantic? Rather quickly. So on average, S. fluitans can actually double its biomass in 22 days, less than half the time it takes for both S. natans 1 and S. natans 8 to do the same. They double their biomass on average 50 to 60 days. However, in reference to the minimum doubling times, S. fluitans can actually double its biomass in as little as 12 days, and S. natans 1 and S. natans 8 in as little as 17 and 27 days. And what is perhaps most curious or interesting about these results is that they do already kind of tie into what Christy has found and also trends that we have seen over the past few years, where S. fluitans 3 is the most dominant morphotype in many of the influxes that are affected in the Caribbean and West Africa. That's right. So while these results do align with those current trends, however, they do not align with the earlier trends where S. natans 8 was the dominant morphotype. So this is still a very much complex question, and there's no simple answer, and that's science. So in conclusion, just a recap of the study, the use of gross mesocosms effectively helping to contain the sargassum and allow for efficient and effective assessment of growth in situ. Sargassum morphotypes, there is indeed a difference in growth rates between the morphotypes, and these morphotypes may then exhibit maximal growth under very specific environmental conditions. And while the present study does offer further insight into the growth dynamics of sargassum and its morphotypes and provide some of the first growth data for natans 8, further studies are definitely required to further explore and clarify the growth responses of sargassum under variable environmental conditions. And of course, we're hoping that the incorporation of such growth data into current forecast models will indeed help to improve the accuracy and usefulness and help us to just manage and adapt to this very, very substantial natural phenomenon that is affecting us in the Caribbean. So Thank you very much. And lastly, I'd just like to thank everyone that has been involved in helping with this study. And of course, our funders, who with this would not have been possible without. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Makeda. What a lovely piece of experimental marine biology. It's great to see that. And I'm sure there might be a question or two for Makeda.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so there's a question online, but in Spanish. So how do we want to do this? We have the translators at the back, so. Okay.
Oh.
Mobile technology.
Hola, buenos días. Soy Dalila de México. ¿Hay traducción?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Bueno, primero que nada, una enorme felicitación al equipo de trabajo de investigación de la doctora Oxenford, a las dos ponentes, y es un trabajo extraordinario como todo lo que hace la doctora Oxenford. Una felicitación muy calurosa, y en el caso particular de nuestra ponente, me fascinó el bioensayo, la manera sencilla, pero muy eficiente de hacer un trabajo de biología experimental marina. Además, ese mesocosmos me hace pensar en los carriles que se utilizan en natación. Y creo que eso viene también de Hansel, que es una excelente nadadora. Bravo, realmente bravo a su trabajo.
Thank you.
So
So that's more of a comment than a question. So thanks.
would you like to respond in any way or?
Yeah, so she was just congratulating me on the work and admiring the mesocosm design and what's not. So yes, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent presentation and really nice piece of work. And thank you very much. I think another round of applause. Now, for the next presentation, we actually going to, I think it was the person who asked the question, Dr. Danila Aldana Aranda from Sinvestav in Mexico, but she's going to give a recorded virtual presentation. And I think we can just play that now.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Dalila Aldana Aranda y vamos a presentar el trabajo en esta sesión del 75 GCFI que lleva por título Presenta el sargazo microplásticos. Es un trabajo que ha sido realizado en cooperación con los autores aquí indicados, que vienen de 3 instituciones diferentes, el CICI, el Instituto de Ciencias del Mar y Limnología en Puerto Morelos y la Unidad Mérida del Sinvestav.
Es una macroalga marina pelágica, la cual su mayor concentración solía estar únicamente en el Atlántico subtropical norte, denominado el Mar de los Sargazos. Sin embargo, en 2011 se detectó una nueva zona de agregación en el Atlántico cerca del Ecuador, que va desde las costas de África a Brasil y sube por todo el Caribe. El sargazo constituye un ecosistema de gran importancia, ya que es hábitat tanto temporal como permanente de diversas especies marinas. Sin embargo, a partir del 2011 se empezaron a registrar cantidades excesivas que llegaban a las costas del Caribe, lo cual es perjudicial, ya que sus lixiviados y la materia orgánica disminuye la incidencia de luz y la disponibilidad de oxígeno, lo cual puede afectar a los pastos marinos, corales y diversos organismos que se encuentran en la zona. Al llegar esta macroalga a la costa empieza a descomponerse y liberar ácido sulfídrico, el cual puede afectar a habitantes y turistas que se encuentran en constante exposición a este. Otro contaminante que se encuentra en el medio marino son los microplásticos, los cuales son plásticos menores a 5 milímetros de diámetro. Lamentablemente hoy en día son ubicuos, se encuentran en todos los ecosistemas y también en diversas especies, incluyendo especies marinas, a las cuales se ha registrado que pueden provocar obstrucción del sistema digestivo, desnutrición, reducción de capacidad reproductiva, tumoraciones, entre otros. Otro contaminante son los metales pesados. Estos son elementos que tienen ciertas características en función de su peso atómico y su densidad, de los cuales se encuentran plomo, mercurio, zinc, cadmio, cobre, entre otros. También se incluyen otros elementos tóxicos, aunque más ligeros, como el aluminio y el arsénico. Estos elementos no son degradables, por lo cual se pueden acumular en tejidos y órganos de organismos, provocando daño al ADN y a procesos enzimáticos. Debido a la gran importancia que tienen estos contaminantes, nos planteamos como objetivo analizar la variación temporal de la presencia de microplásticos y metales pesados e identificar las características de los microplásticos del sargazo que arriba a las costas de Puerto Morelos, Quintana Roo, durante el año 2021. Para esto se realizaron tomas de Sargassum fluitans 3 en Puerto Morelos, Quintana Roo, durante 9 meses, de marzo a octubre del 2021 y enero 2022. Cada muestra se obtuvieron 3 réplicas de 5 gramos de sargazo seco cada una. A estas se les realizaron enjuagues con agua destilada y también un poco de peróxido de hidrógeno para eliminar materia orgánica. A partir de estos enjuagues se obtuvieron 160 mililitros de líquido y, por otro lado, los 5 gramos de la fronda de sargazo. Estos fueron analizados a través del estereoscopio para obtener, registrar el número de microplásticos, su color y su forma. Por otro lado, en el microscopio electrónico de barrido se analizaron en cuanto a los microplásticos, su tamaño, desgaste, su composición química y su morfoestructura, y también se analizó el sargazo para observar la presencia de metales pesados en la superficie. Como resultados, aquí observamos unas imágenes del lado izquierdo. Vemos que la imagen A es un microfragmento de color negro. En las imágenes B, C y D son microfibras. En cuanto a la forma de los microplásticos observados, el 90% de ellos fueron en forma de fibra y el 10% en forma de fragmento. En cuanto al color que se encontró, en su mayoría fueron transparentes, negros y azul, y en menor medida se encontró microplásticos color rojo, multicolor. Este es que en una misma microfibra se tiene más de un color y también se encuentran otros colores. En cuanto a la variación temporal de la abundancia de microplásticos en sargazo, se registró por gramo de sargazo seco. Se tiene que hubo una variación temporal denotada por los asteriscos. De forma general, en abril y septiembre se tuvo una mayor presencia de microplásticos y en junio y enero una menor. Acá se tienen imágenes de la morfoestructura de los microplásticos. Del lado izquierdo se tienen 2 imágenes, A y B, en donde se registra la talla de los microfibras que van desde las 340 y 1200 micrómetros. A ellas se les encontraron objetos adheridos en forma de esfera y bastones que están en las imágenes C y D, los cuales pueden ser bacterias, cocoes o bacilos, que no es de extrañarse ya que en el medio marino hay una alta diversidad de microorganismos. Sin embargo, esto se debería de analizar en futuros estudios. Del lado derecho se tienen las imágenes E y F, donde se observa un nivel de desgaste en las microfibras. Acá se tiene una tabla donde se muestra en medio de porcentaje de peso seco metales pesados que se encontraron en los microplásticos. Se analizaron microplásticos de distintos colores. En el color negro se encontró la presencia de aluminio y plomo. En la microfibra de color rojo se detectó aluminio, hierro, cobre, zinc y arsénico. Y en el microplástico color azul se detectó aluminio, cobre, plomo y arsénico. En esta imagen podemos observar los elementos en microplástico, en este caso de color rojo, que se observó En la imagen superior se hizo el análisis en una zona lisa del microplástico, en donde se tienen los elementos del lado derecho. Y en la imagen inferior vemos que se realizó este análisis en una zona rugosa del mismo microplástico, en donde se detectó mayor presencia de elementos, incluyendo el aluminio, titanio, hierro y cobre. Acá se tiene una tabla de la media de porcentaje de peso seco de los metales que se encontraron en el sargazo. Se detectó la presencia de níquel, cobre, arsénico, mercurio y plomo en los meses señalados. Acá se tiene la tabla de los valores máximos detectados en porcentaje de peso seco de la variación temporal de presencia de metales pesados en sargazo. En los meses de julio a enero hubo una presencia considerable de cloro y potasio. En cuanto a los metales pesados encontrados, vemos que para níquel hubo una mayor presencia en mayo, de cobre en junio, de los metales arsénico y mercurio hubo una mayor presencia, un porcentaje más alto de julio, y para plomo en marzo. Y bueno, diversos estudios han analizado la abundancia de microplásticos en diferentes sedimentos del Caribe. Se registran microplásticos por kilogramo, vemos cómo van desde los 17 hasta los 10.400 microplásticos por kilogramo, dependiendo del sedimento. Sin embargo, en el sargazo, en este estudio, se ha registrado una mayor abundancia, con 17.900 microplásticos por kilogramo aproximadamente. Acá se tiene una tabla donde se ven los elementos y metales que se encontraron en el sargazo. Como ya se mencionó, hubo presencia del níquel, cobre, arsénico y plomo, lo cual registra también Rodríguez Martínez, que ha estado presente en el sargazo que ha llegado a Puerto Morelos en el año 2018. Sin embargo, ellos no reportan la presencia de mercurio, metal pesado sí se registró en este estudio, por lo cual se deberá de analizar más profundamente en otros estudios. También hubo una notable presencia del cloro y el potasio en el sargazo. Se ha visto que hay un fertilizante que se usa ampliamente para la producción de alimento, que es el cloruro de potasio, el cual puede estar desembocando al mar, estimulando el crecimiento de esta macroalga. Sin embargo, esto se deberá analizar más profundamente en otros estudios. Acá se tiene una gráfica que representa la variación temporal de abundancia de los microplásticos, representado en color naranja, y la velocidad máxima del viento que se encontró en la zona, representada de color azul. Se puede observar una aparente relación inversa entre estos dos factores. En cuanto a mayor velocidad de viento, hay una menor concentración de microplásticos. Esto coincide con lo registrado por Collington y Kulka en 2012. Ya como conclusiones, se tiene que se registró por primera vez la presencia de microplásticos en el sargazo, así como su variación temporal. Predominó la forma de fibra en los microplásticos, así como los colores transparente, negro y azul. Se detectó una presencia de metales pesados en los microplásticos y se observa una aparente relación de estos con su rugosidad. También se detectó la presencia de arsénico y metales pesados como cobre, plomo, níquel y mercurio en el sargazo. Es importante mencionar que la presencia de microplásticos y metales pesados en el sargazo se debe tener en cuenta para la implementación de este recurso en otros sectores. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Dalila. Do we have a question for Dalila? I don't think we have any particular questions for you, Dalila, but if you would, going once, going twice? No, but thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. Clearly the interaction there between plastic in general and the sargassum is one of the big emerging issues and how we deal with that. Very interesting to hear it from the microplastic perspective. Thank you very much. A further round of applause for Dalila. And we stay with a virtual presentation for just now. Oh, so Nathan is here. So I'd like to welcome Nathan Putman. Nathan is from LGL Ecological Research Associates from the US. And I think we'd just be getting his presentation up in a minute or two. Nathan's going to talk to us today about the Sargassum inundation reports and validating satellite monitoring with citizen science photographs. Nathan, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. And so what I'll be talking about today, as just mentioned, is and also as one of the products for monitoring sargassum that has been developed by NOAA in collaboration with the University of South Florida. Shelly Ann mentioned it in her presentation, but they're the sargassum inundation reports. And one of the things that is I'll just go ahead and talk about stuff. So as we all know, sargassum is a wonderful ecosystem, right? It's practically magic. It's like a floating benthic community moving across the open ocean. And there's a variety of marine species that use it as habitat, and fishers make use of it. And it's delightful. And then when it comes into coastal areas, at least when a lot of it comes into coastal areas, it causes problems or opportunities. But whatever the case, it would be helpful to know when and where those sort of inundations are going to occur and to be able to monitor that through time. And so the Sargassum inundation reports make use of satellite observations to monitor the risk of sargassum coming into coastal areas. And they do this over the entire region that we're interested in. So us here at GCFI, the Gulf and Caribbean has, so the satellite imagery is compiled over these, on a weekly basis at looking at sargassum densities over sort of 30 to 50 kilometers offshore throughout the Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico. We've been putting this together from about 2019 to present, and it provides these weekly status updates as to whether coastlines are at high, medium, or low risk of sargassum coming into shore. And as I was saying, it's a really great product because it has this wide geographic scope, but then it's also it gives you a bit of precision as well. So these panels on the right, on your right, show a year's worth of weekly risk for different regions. So from Galveston down to Barbados, predicting or I guess estimating whether there's a high or high to low levels of risk of sargassum coming in. And it would be, there's a lot of value in it, but it's, as I mentioned, it's looking at data that's 30 to 50 kilometers offshore. And important question is, how does that risk relate to what's actually onshore? And so the folks who've been putting this together, this has always been at the forefront of their minds. You can do a lot with satellites, but what does it mean? And so the project goals here were to take basically some existing publications, some data from existing publications, and see how they align. What's the correspondence between what you see in satellite and what you see on the ground? And so we want to assess how these satellite observations correspond to what you see on the ground. In this publication describing the sargassum inundation reports from last year, some opportunistically collected photos suggest there is this concordance. In this image, you see that, okay, there's Cancun is predicted to have a high level of risk, and there's this photo from that same time period. And boy, there sure is a lot of sargassum on that beach. So that's great, but a more robust set of samples would be nice for comparison. Another thing we're interested in is exploring whether inclusion of wind data could improve the correspondence between what you see offshore and what happens on the beach. And then with that, moving maybe in the direction away from just monitoring, but to forecasting as well, right? So our approach for achieving those goals was to make use of, again, these publicly available data that have been published, citizen science initiatives that have been monitoring sargassum using some relatively standardized beach photos through a team at Florida International University, and then also a group at UNAM in Quintana Roo, who have provided us with sort of a single site. So instead of region-wide, looking broadly across the region, they've got a single site, but it's continuously monitored. So very, very standardized a way to compare what's on the ground to what we see in the satellites. And so my role in this is basically putting pieces together. So this work has been done by a lot of collaborators at a lot of different institutions. I want to highlight a couple of folks who are especially important. Everybody's got an important role to play, but I want to mention Taylor B.A. She's here at the conference. She was instrumental in sort of helping come up with the design of putting all these pieces together. Lal Iparak from FIU, Florida International University, instrumental in building this photo database that we rely very heavily on in this study. And then Emily Ackerman, also with LGL, she's looked at an awful lot of photos to quantify the amount of sargassum that is in them. Joaquin Trenanes with NOAA and the University of Santiago in Spain he's the guy who's producing the sargassum inundation reports weekly. And then Gustavo Goni with NOAA, the Physical Oceanography Division of AOML, and he has been, the spearhead wanting to get NOAA involved in this. Pushing NOAA to expend its resources on this monitoring problem in question. Always a hang up at the bears. But anyway, so the sargassum inundation reports, basically what we're doing is we take the 7-day composites of the alternative floating algal index developed by Chuan Min Hu at the University of South Florida. That gets converted into a floating algal density at about 0.1 degrees resolution, so on the order of 10 kilometers or so. And after masking that 0 to 30 kilometers of sort of nearshore areas where the satellites don't perform great in terms of uncertainty. And then within a 50-kilometer radius of each of those 10-kilometer grid points, the density is computed to estimate inundation potential with various thresholds for low, medium, and high. And when we take our wind data, so the wind data that we're using is from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, the ERA5 reanalysis, and it's winds at 10 meters above sea level, so pretty standard. It's an hourly product and at a 30-kilometer grid resolution. What we've done for our analyses has been to take a weighted average of the hourly shoreward wind speeds at the 4 closest grid points to each coastal location, and then compute mean, minimum, and maximum shoreward wind speeds over sort of the preceding 3 days of where we have concurrent data between the satellite imagery and the citizen science photos and the video analyses. All right, so a little bit about Sargassum Watch, the FIU product here. It has been, they've been collecting data across 6,200 sites last time I checked, which was last week. And what we have done is taken a subset of those photos, 436 sites across Southeast Florida, excluding Southeast Florida, because 60% of the sites in that database are from that region, and anything we saw is going to be heavily weighted towards that. And so we didn't want to bias our conclusions to any peculiarities of that one region. But the nice thing about having all that data in that one spot is that we could look at, with Southeast Florida specifically, whether there are annual differences in any relationships observed and seasonal differences with a fairly sort of uniform sort of sample design and sample sizes to look across those for those questions. And so for these citizen science photos, what we did was crop the area, select an area where sargassum could be, so you'll get rid of the sky and the photos and things like that. This platform that sargassum is not going to wash up on. We select 50 random points and then identify what is under each one of those points, whether it's sargassum or sand or some other vegetation. And then we simply compute the percent of beach and water that are covered by sargassum. And that's our sort of our metric that we're comparing against. And so what this shows on your x-axis is the floating algal density. So those are the Sargassum inundation report satellite images. And then we have the percent of Sargassum in the photo. And there's a relationship between them, and it's pointing in the right direction. But one thing that struck me looking at this immediately was when you have no Sargassum observed in your satellite imagery, you can have anywhere from 0% of Sargassum on the beach to 100% of your beach covered with Sargassum, which is sort of amusing in some ways. But if you look at, if we just sort of compartmentalize, so taking when there's no Sargassum detected, when there's wind offshore, the percent of the Sargassum in the photos is considerably lower, significantly lower than the amount of Sargassum present when it is onshore. So that suggests that maybe taking into account wind would be a useful thing in trying to contextualize these sort of estimates of risk. And so doing that with in this case with a multiple regression analysis, we have combined the regression between this satellite-based imagery and then the wind data. And so as you can see on that bottom graph, when wind is more shoreward, you end up with more Sargassum in your photo. When it's less shoreward, you end up with less. And if you just look at some variance plots here, you can explain, so y-axis is how much of the variation in densities on the beach are explained by the Sargassum inundation report alone versus if you combine that with wind. And the wind data seems to really help in improving the correspondence between on-the-ground data and the satellite-based imagery. So moving to Southeast Florida, are there differences, annually? And again, we see the same basic idea. So those different bars are different years that we looked at. The Sargassum inundation reports alone don't have a great correspondence with what you see on the beach, but if you add wind data, they improve a lot, and that relationship seems consistent among the years that we looked at. Now, if we look at seasonal differences, what sort of jumps out is that the spring season. So that green bar is April through June. We can do a better job of accounting for what you see on the beach with the combination of satellite and wind data than in other seasons. And there's probably something worth thinking about there. My guess is that it has to do with the sort of the nature of taking photos and identifying whether Sargassum is fresh or it's been there for a while. And so you get early in the season and things match up. And then later in the season, you might end up with people taking photos of old Sargassum that hasn't, that washed ashore weeks ago, and there's no Sargassum present now, but it's still there sitting on the beach. You also get up into potential things with like cleanup issues and people removing it. Anyway, but the springtime is a bit better. And then, so that sort of alludes to some of the complications of using a non-standardized survey where you don't have all the information going on in terms of using that as a validation product. Still, I think quite useful, quite informative, and is good for making a better product. But making use of sort of this continuous video monitoring approach that the team at UNAM did, what we have there is over 2019 to 2020, weekly records of Sargassum mats moving into the area. So they are recording the number of mats that move into an area, into that particular area. And what we can look at there, the same basic graph here. So the mats per week coming in corresponds pretty cleanly to the floating algal densities from satellite. We add wind to that. And again, a positive correlation, more shoreward means more Sargassum. And in this case, also, the Sargassum inundation reports do a decent job of explaining variance, but adding wind improves that significantly. So with that, I would like to conclude that including wind conditions does improve the correspondence between the Sargassum inundation reports and the on-the-ground observations. those relationships are detected both with sort of broad scale but gappy data from, say, Citizen Science Initiative, as well as from this continuous monitoring approach. So fairly robust relationships. There's low annual variability in these relationships. There is some seasonal variation, which I won't belabor. We talked about that already. And really, I think there's some promising avenues for future work, notably including shoreward wind into the Sargassum inundation reports to get a better indication of what might be happening in your particular areas. And then the opportunities to explore time lags between the Sargassum inundation report and wind data to actually predict Sargassum beaching. So could we get some forecasts of 3, 5, 7 days out using these approaches? So with that, I'll take a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nathan. Yeah, very impressive, and clearly that whole wind factor is what seems to drive it at that very local scale. Yeah, I'm sure there must be 1 or 2 questions for Nathan. Anything online at all? No. Okay, well, if you do, Hazel, please.
I was watching Don, thinking he was going to ask a question. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk, and really nice to hear it directly from you, how the inundation reports and the citizen science are coming together. And one thing that is clearly missing is any citizen science from our area in the Eastern Caribbean, which is the area of the inundation reports that disturbs me a little bit, because you often look at the Eastern Caribbean islands and there's a great big red ring around entire islands, which is not the true picture, because we don't get sargassum coming up on the leeward shores. So in some senses, it kind of puts off tourists if tourists are looking at this and seeing the Eastern Caribbean islands are totally covered in sargassum when they're not. So it'd be very nice to address that issue. Thank you.
Yes, yes. So so in terms of addressing that issue, one could imagine doing that with the wind data, for instance. If it's, if the wind is moving westward, it's obviously going to be pushing sargassum away. So even at a relatively coarse scale that we're looking at here, I mean, 10 kilometer, that kind of thing, it seems like that would be sufficient to clean up some of those big red blobs. Have you talked to Joaquin or Gustavo any about this? Okay. Yeah. So that, I mean, that sounds great. And certainly, like I said, my role is sort of putting pieces together and basically trying to improve the monitoring, improve the forecasts. And that's a great thing to go back to NOAA to talk about. And we should catch up definitely more. I'd love to. And,
great, thank you very much, Nathan. I think we'll have another round of applause. That was an excellent presentation. Now we are going to move to a different part of the Caribbean now. I'd like to welcome Dr. Judith Reming. She works for the Nature Parks Organizations of Bonaire, known as STINAPA, is that correct? And she's going to talk to us today about turning the tide on, or the brown tide on Bonaire's island of Bonaire, and the Sargassum response plan. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Judith Reming, and I'm working on Bonaire at STINAPA as manager of the Bonaire National Marine Park. I'm managing the Bonaire National Marine Park with a group of rangers. And when you talk about the Bonaire National Marine Park, you're talking about all the seas surrounding the island of Bonaire, and it's from the high water mark out until 60 meters of depth. That also makes that we can work with nature protection rules and regulations that we can also use to create a Sargassum response plan. is going the right way. Okay. We mainly have sargassum at our east and south coast. That means that sargassum isn't hitting directly our west coast where our resorts are situated. So directly tourism doesn't have an impact of sargassum, but indirectly it of course has. When you look at our east and south coast, we have a lot of bays there. Bays like Lagoon, Washikemba, but also Loch. And especially of Loch, in Loch we have a lot of nature and a diversity of nature present. We have mangroves over there, we have seagrass over there, we have sea turtles, conch, but it's also our nursery for juvenile fish. So that makes Loch of importance locally, but also internationally, because Loch is an area that is also protected as a Ramsar area. That means that it has special protection under the Convention of Wetlands. When we talk about sargassum, that also means that we as a team always have focused on Loch, and we created less focus on Lagoon, but we also tried to clean up sargassum at the Lagoon Bay. So how long are we dealing with those? Oh, there's the television. Okay, how long are we dealing with those influxes of sargassum? Well, on Bonaire, we experienced sargassum for the last 5 years. And because it's entering bays, it means that it can enter the bays, but it never gets out of the bays again. So that also means that you need to clean up sargassum manually. And that is very hard for us, because for Bonaire, we have to deal with big influxes of sargassum. And when it enters your bay, it also enters shallow water. That means that sargassum is starting to decay in ultimately 3 days. And we're just not managing to get it out in 3 days. And what then happens is that sargassum becomes very heavy. It doesn't float anymore, and we cannot reach sargassum anymore from shore. And that poses problems, because the new sargassum floating in, the fresh sargassum, we then also cannot take out anymore. So what do we do? For us, it's really important to start patrolling. We know basically that sargassum will enter the waters around Bonaire somewhere between January and July. So we always start patrolling every week in January. And we go to the same sites, because we know that if we see sargassum at Arawak, we will have that sargassum in Lagoon in like a day, and we will have it in Loch in a day or a day and a half. So that's really important for us. And what we do is we always make pictures. So we make sure that we have a database, and we keep that database week by week. So we're also having the possibility to look back and see, okay, when did it start exactly? What did we do exactly? And really make evaluation reports. And of course, our biologists are also using this data scientifically. When you talk about cleanup, what do we do? Well, when we have influxes of sargassum, our rangers basically have their whole focus on sargassum. So we cannot do our other tasks anymore. So we clean up with the rangers, but we also get help from the volunteers. And when we have a great group of volunteers, but they mostly can help us during the weekends. So that means during the week, we have a problem. That's why we also started since this year with asking hired help. So paying to get help from people cleaning up sargassum. So we have at least a big enough group to do something manually. Okay, and then we always do it in the mornings, and we don't do it in the afternoons, because those influxes, they take like 7 to 10 days at the minimum, and you just cannot clean up the whole day. So that's also why we started with the use of excavators to get out sargassum, but we also need to really look at the balance, like you want to take out the sargassum, but you also do not want to harm the nature. Yes, and then I do like to say that if you're standing there day by day, and I can say that because I'm also there, and cleaning up that sargassum sometimes is also a mental struggle, because you're cleaning up and you're thinking like, what am I doing? These mangroves are dying. These seagrass are being smothered in seagrass. But then it's also very important to keep the motivation, to do it together and to keep working on. But as a manager, you really have to take that into account as well. Okay. Oh, yeah. And then because we have had sargassum for 5 years now, and because we're monitoring it closely, we can also say something about the short-term effects. So what do we see as short-term effects? Well, we see everything dying. So we see dead fish, we see dead turtles, we see mangroves dying, we see seagrass beds dying. And in the long term, we see that because we have more prolonging periods of time, sargassum, and we have more influxes of sargassum, we also see that nature isn't able to restore itself anymore. So that's the long-term effect that we see. And when you talk about luck is not only important for nature. For us, it's part of our cultural heritage. It's part of our, it's locally so important. We have our fishermen there. We have our windsurfing there. We have kayaking. So it's an area that's also of value for tourism. And of course, we also have to deal with the negative effects on public health, because sargassum also is at some point negative for people working in it. So that made that Stinapa thought, okay, we need to ask our government for a sargassum response plan. We need help in this. We need to know what are the responsibilities, who is doing what, and how are we going to communicate about this, all those types of things. So that's difficult because we have this dual system of governance. We have a local government with whom you have to negotiate about the sargassum response plan, but then at the end, you also need to have the approval of the Dutch government because it's their end responsibility. So that wasn't an easy process. And Stinapa also said, that's not something that we're going to wait for. So last year, we invested $100,000 in sargassum booms because we saw our oil booms being broken. We couldn't use that anymore. So we started using the sargassum booms this year. And at the end of last year, when we signed that sargassum response plan, also the government said, yes, we're going to invest $100,000 more in sargassum booms. So with those sargassum booms, we're able to bring sargassum to a certain place and to, by that, also protect parts of nature. But then you have to deal with how do we get sargassum out in time, because we do need to get it out. And then there's another thing, and that is that we see sargassum moving in the bay itself. So we see it moving to the north, and we don't know exactly why that is. So that's something that we're researching at the moment, but that also made that we needed to create an extra extraction point. And because we have these mangroves forests, that meant that we had to cut away actually 15 meters of mangroves to create that extraction point to be able to protect the nature around those extraction points better. And that was, of course, a hard decision to make. And then, we were able to take more sargassum out, but then you have to get it away from your extraction point because it's still decaying, it's still bubbling, it's still stinking. So that was a very difficult thing to do. And then people became sick. So what did we do then? We escalated. And we escalated it to our government. And that really made our government say this year, okay, we're going to invest $800,000 more in cleaning up sargassum. And I'm not going to say what we purchased with that money because you see it on the slide. But I'm going to say that Stinapa is going to make sure that there are storage and maintaining facilities. And we're now training our rangers because you can take a different ownership also in the sargassum process, in the cleanup process, and that's actually interesting for us. Okay, because we are having these monitoring reports, these patrolling reports, and because we also are really informing our stakeholders every week during the sargassum period about what we're doing, we can also say that in 2021, we scooped up sargassum for 23 days, and in 2022, it is 48 days. So we see that growing year by year. And that also makes that we're not going to settle for what you saw only on the next slide. We're also going to invest in pumping out sargassum from the water. So that's something that we're busy with currently. And we have found a company who's willing to do that with us. And we're now busy with the contract phase of that. So I think we can use that next year. And then we can tell about our experiences with that. So what did we take out? We took out in 2022 an estimation because we also use drone images, so we can use the pictures and all the data that we're collecting to also make an estimation on what we take out. And that's about, well, we had in log 26,000 tons of sargassum this year, and we took out approximately 1,066 tons of that sargassum. So that is 4%. That's not a lot. But for us, it's huge because we were never able to get so much sargassum out. And now the big challenge is how do we get out more? And yeah, that's what we're working on. Here I have some images about the drone images that you see, and also our rangers and our volunteers and hired help in action. And then what now? Because I only spoke about short term, like what are we doing short term with sargassum? And there's also a longer term plan. We need a longer term plan because at the end of the day, we have sargassum in other bays as well. We're going to make a focus this year, the upcoming year, also on lagoon, but we need to have that longer term plan. And that's something we're actually now collecting data for, because when you talk about long-term planning, you talk about preventive measurements. And then we need a lot of data about wind, data about currents, data about depth. And when you go outside of lock, we also have to deal with a coastline that is really steep rapidly. So at the moment, preventive measures for us aren't on the market yet. So that's something that we're now discussing with the company. Our biologists and also other volunteers are helping us with the data. And yeah, we go and see what we can do in like the upcoming 5 to 10 years for the longer term protection of our base. And of course, you also have to know that when you have your plan, then you need to find the finances. And that also takes approximately 1.5 to 2 years at a minimum. So what would be my recommendations as a manager having to deal with sargassum? Well, I placed it on the sheet, but I want to highlight a few points. We use a monitoring tool. It's called SAMtool, and we pay for the use of SAMtool. We're really happy that we have SAMtool because it makes us able to also see in the first kilometers of the shore, like what's going on, what do we expect? Is it perfect? It isn't perfect. We cannot, we still sometimes don't see the influxes coming, but it helps us. Then it's really important to do the patrolling, but I already talked about that, and to track everything, to create your own data to use. And then it's all about investing and being creative. We have old oil booms. We're not going to toss away the old oil booms. We're going to fix them, use them again, make sure that we can help the wind service protecting their area, or help with the fisherman hut by creating a wall of coral stones. Those kinds of things is being creative. And then it's really important to also have good contact with your stakeholders, be clear who those stakeholders are, and keep in touch with them. And last but not least, motivation. When you're working there day in, day out, scooping up sargassum, being in that process, you need to keep your people motivated. And you also, when you have your sargassum season finished, you need to reward by creating something to do with each other and to discuss, okay, it was a heavy season or it wasn't a heavy season, but just acknowledge the help that you're getting. So this was actually my presentation about managing sargassum on Bonaire. And when you have questions, just let me know. I see I have a minute left, so maybe. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Judith. That really puts the focus of the problem in stark reality, I think, and the real scale and just how do you tackle it?
Yeah, it's different. Yeah.
So would anyone like to put a question to Judith? We have a minute or two.
Hi, Judith.
Yes, hi.
Please.
Wonderful work you're doing. And
thank you.
You know, working in a protected area, I do understand your pain. And I like the fact that you're looking at all of your stakeholders and trying to figure out how to work with them.
Yeah.
This is for you and probably for others. When you remove the sargassum, especially since you're not processing, what do you do with it? Where do you put it? And how do you ensure that you're not removing sand and other valuable assets when you're doing that.
Yeah, actually, we are removing sand. So that's something that we don't want to do, but we just have to do it because we also practically need to work with Sargassum, and we're working on beaches as well. We're doing research now to, is Sargassum also like decontaminating the sand? So we have the sand piled up in certain areas. We storage it over there, and we're doing this research. And when we know more, we also know what we can do with the sand. So the sand we really keep apart. And then with the Sargassum, at the moment, because we also have the rules and regulations stating that you cannot bring something into nature on Bonaire that can be a hazard to the nature itself, we bring it to our landfill. And there it's also kept separate in big piles. And yeah, it also still contains sand. So what you see is that they have piles of sand and piles of Sargassum over there. So it goes to the landfill at the moment.
Thank you.
Yes.
Time for one more quick question, if anyone's got one. Yeah, Shelley Ann, please.
Hi, we started engaging with some of your colleagues in Curacao. They recently had a workshop in August, I believe. So is there any knowledge exchange between the ABC Islands in terms of addressing the influx events? And a personal plug, I asked for a profile for Curacao on the website, but I'd like to work with you for a profile of Bonaire on the Sargassum Hub as well. So I'll follow up with you on that.
Yeah, no, that's great. When you look at the ABC Islands, we are a nature organization, and there are different nature organizations that we're working with on those islands. But we see that the focus on Curacao, it wasn't really on Sargassum. So in Curacao, you see a lot of private people who are now looking into Sargassum because they have private problems with Sargassum, and they're reaching out to companies that we are also working with. So we know what's going on Sargassum, but in Curacao, until now, there wasn't a lot of focus about like cleaning up Sargassum. So no, we don't really have that exchange of information yet. I would love to start it up, and I actually asked DCNA to help me with that. But it is something that is needed. What we are doing is we have this sum tool, and when we see at different islands big influxes going towards those islands and not to Bonaire, we flag it towards the nature organizations or the government, yeah, people that we know who are dealing with Sargassum over there.
Great. Well, these are the kind of connections we need to keep making. That's us really at the end of our session for this morning. We've been running a little bit late from the start, so we're going to take a coffee break now. I'd like to keep that break for half an hour, and if we can come back for 11:30, we'll get started again there. Do you want to make an announcement?
With regards to the field trips, I would have sent out an announcement. So the dive-in trip has been cancelled. So in terms of field trip options, one change is that we have, well, I don't think this affects the virtual. So the Emerald Coast Science Center, it's still $12 entry, but we're not charging for transport. If you wish to go, it's $12 and it's $6 for transport, sorry. Not what we originally said at $10. If you wish to go to the Emerald Science Center, there is a sign up form on the registration desk. If you have signed up and you've changed your mind and you no longer want to go, please cross your name out. The Gulfarium previously had a cover charge of $25. They have agreed to allow all GCFI participants to go for free once you have your badge. So that one is, so essentially the only one we're providing transport for is the Emerald Coast Science Center, $6 for transport, $12 entry. Everything else in terms of the Veterans Park Baywalk is self-guided and it's walking distance. Same with the Gulfarium, free entry once you have your badge, also walking distance. And we are not providing transport to the US Air Force Armament Museum. However, you have the afternoon off, there are Ubers and taxis. And if you're really excited, you can walk. So please, if you want to go to the Science Center, you have to sign up within this coffee break because we want to confirm the numbers that we need to provide transport for. Thank you.
So if I could just have one big last round of applause for all the speakers this morning. I think it was a great session. Thank you very much, everybody.
Sorry, it's $6 entry to the science center, nothing for transport. My bad.
Your hands in mine, and you don't have to listen carefully. I'll tell you 1,000 times. Then you feel, put it all on me. Your thoughts, I want everything. And when you get sad, like you do sometimes, put it all on me. Put it all on me. And I thought you need and that's all you need to know. And that's all you need to know. And that's all you need to know. And you don't have to listen carefully. I'll tell you 1,000 times. And that's all you need to know. I'll lift you when you're feeling low. I'll hold you when the night gets cold. You'll never have to be alone. And that's all you need to know. No love lost, we've got you all night. No clouds push you to my sky. You'll never have to be alone. And that's all you need
See another revolution, on a way to be a better person. We come together like we should. We could, we do. Don't jingle, but you jiggle. So right over here, because it's heavy in the middle. Moving like I'm pushing on the groove, so I groove up. Then she wanna learn, so we play school, and I school that. But not like this. We can toss and turn, rumble, tumble, and twist. Anything you want, I give it. Fantasies will so lay down on my lap. Lady love on my baby girl. Spread your wings so we can fly around the world. Harmony, harmony, your fingertips are calling me. When you drop the kisses to the cue, you drop the bomb on me. Stretch it, flex it, flex it. Give me the permission, I'm blessed. I'm blessed like Buddha. Buddha at the best. We can lay out at the level, put your head on my chest. One time. See the phone. Yeah. Like, here we go. What are we gonna do? Rose are red, then violets are blue. Never fit plenty if you get plenty good loving. Kiss away your hot, do what I got to keep you bubbling. Give me right, my lonesome dove. Tell your man what is the thing called love? I'm not quite sure as to what is going down, but I'm feeling hunky-dory about the thing I found. Oh, come on. Hey, man. Yeah, all up in money earning my friends from decades, you know what I'm saying? Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, Manhattan, the whole New York City. I said I love you, that's it for you. Stop, and you don't quit. You got to keep on until the do it like this. You don't stop, and you don't quit. You got to keep on and on and on. Yeah, I.
Welcome back to the second half of the Sargassum session. Please take your seats and we'll be starting in just a few seconds. So I'm Hazel Oxenford from Surmies, and I would like to introduce my co-PI on two large Sargassum projects that we have, Janice Cumberbatch. And you will notice that I don't say much and I don't do much. So in true nature, I'm going to hand over to Janice to do the emceeing in this session. So I like to think that I lead from behind, but actually I don't lead at all. I have a wonderful bunch of young students who are far brighter than me that are quite capable of carrying the baton now, and young professionals. So I'm extremely happy to hand over to them. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you so much for telling me that I'm a young professional. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the second part of this amazing session. I'm sitting here feeling very, very proud as I watch students that I trained present so expertly. And so I will not waste any more time. I'm going to introduce another one of them, Michaela Small. She is going to speak on the complexities of validating Sargassum forecasts. Michaela?
Good morning, everyone. Like Janice said, my name is Michaela Small, and I'm a research assistant with the Sargassum project at Surmies UWI campus. So as stated by my colleagues earlier, Sargassum has been inundating Caribbean coast in extraordinary volumes since 2011, and this is why forecasts are important, as they help to determine the future Sargassum influxes and help with the management of Sargassum. And this is particularly important for persons in the tourism and fisheries industry to help them to better manage these influxes. So Surmies and the University of Southern Mississippi has been working together to produce Sargassum outlook bulletins for the Caribbean Lesser Antillean Islands. So this is the Eastern Caribbean island chain, and they have been produced since October 2019. And as Shadi would have stated, they are forecast for a 3-month period and they're released every 2 months. So currently the forecast needs to be validated, hence the reason for this study. So the forecast is generated using free access process 7-day composite images from the MODIS satellite made available by the University of South Florida. And how the model works is that we have 20 years of ocean surface data, and then we have a 0.5% of windage, which helps to better simulate the surface currents. And then these work together to help to move the sargassum within the model. And then the program tracks the movement of the sargassum, and it takes note of the ending location of the sargassum and the ending date. And as you can see with this 60-degree west meridian line, what happens is the forecast tracks the sargassum, and when the sargassum pixels travel past this line, then that is when a sargassum pixel is considered a sargassum point, and the date that the sargassum passed the line is recorded. All of the pixels then that pass this line are accumulated, and then the volume of sargassum for the forecast is determined. I forgot to mention the forecast is based on the northern, middle, and southern region of the Caribbean. So the objective of this study is to validate forecasts at the island level using ground truthing data collected at the index beach in Barbados using our sargassum monitoring protocol, which helps to determine the volume of sargassum. And we did this for a year's time. Right, to help with the monitoring of the sargassum, Surmies developed this sargassum monitoring protocol. And how it works is that we establish a 100-meter stretch of beach, and then we measure the height of the sargassum as demonstrated in the video. And we do this for 5 transects, and we take note of whether the sargassum is fresh or old sargassum. And fresh sargassum is any sargassum that lands on the beach within the last tide, and we know it's fresh sargassum based on the golden color. Right. Our index beach is located on the east coast of Barbados. And this is the coast that experiences the highest volume of sargassum influxes. And we've been monitoring the beach. Oops. Right, we've been monitoring the beach since July 9th, 2021, and we calculate the volume for this 100-meter stretch of beach as stated for the protocol. And we have been doing surveys on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And originally we started with a weekly surveys, but then we had to go to bi-weekly surveys because of the cost associated with weekly surveys. Right. So as I stated earlier, we use the 60-degree west meridian line. However, for the validation of the forecast, we decided to do it at island level. So Barbados is located within the middle region, and rather than focusing on the entire area, we decided to focus in on just Barbados. So we moved the finish line from just 60 to 59.25, and then just stretching from 12.75 to 13.50. And what we did is that we used the same forecasting tracks, and then we just use this line to determine the level of influxes that Barbados specifically would be experiencing. So for analysis, we use different methods to decide which was the best way to determine how to compare the data. And we tried different ways to smooth the forecasting data, and we like the forecasting data by different time periods. And what we found is that using a weekly average and then lagging the forecast by 7 days worked best for the analysis. And then we carried out linear regression analysis on the data to compare the ground truthing to the forecasting data. Right. So initial comparison showed a crude level of agreement between the data, and then when we carried out linear regression, this corroborated what we found with the initial comparison. So as you can see, some of the peaks and the valleys with the forecasting data and the ground truthing data lines up. And then linear regression showed that there was a significant relationship between the two. So the p-value was less than 0.01. And then there was a strong positive correlation between the forecasting data and the ground truthing data, with R being 0.493. So this means that the peaks and the valleys of the forecasting data and the ground truthing data lines up. The R squared was just 0.243, so it wasn't very strong, and the R squared value tells you how the highs and the lows match in size. So the results essentially were saying that while the forecast is good at predicting the events of the sargassum, it wasn't so good at determining the aptitude of the events. And this is the graph showing the linear regression with a best fit line. An improvement in the results with the 1 week lag suggests that the forecast is predicting 1 week too early and may require the wind in the forecast model to decrease. And currently we are working on backtracking with various model and wind stresses in order to check the model parameters. So in conclusion, this is the first attempt to validate the forecast. So there's need to do a lot more validation and work with more of the data. However, overall, the forecast is good at predicting the influxes for the month, but at the higher resolutions, it's not doing a very good job. So the daily predictions are not very good. For the July prediction, the forecast predicted that it would be severe for the middle region, which Barbados is located in. And as you can see in this drone footage, this is our index beach, and this was from July 28th this year. And you can see is a high influx of sargassum, and it's the highest amount of sargassum we've ever experienced at our index beach since starting our surveys. So there's many reasons for the mismatch between the forecasting data and the ground truthing data. For example, the satellite only picks up large mass of sargassum. So there's a lot of sargassum that is still being missed for the forecast. And then the forecast is picking up large mass, but it's not necessarily a case where these mass that the forecast is picking up comes ashore. So you have local currents, tides, and winds, which we don't quite understand fully, that influence how sargassum moves offshore onto the shore and becomes beached. And then the surveys are done at a higher resolution. Surveys are done at a lower resolution, and they need to be improved both temporally and spatially. So like I said, we do forecasts on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So ideally forecasts should be done on a daily basis and for more than 100-meter stretch of beach. So ideally we will have a larger beach and then multiple beaches. And we would like to have ground truthing carried out on various Eastern Caribbean islands, and we put something in place to train persons to carry out the sargassum monitoring protocol on the different islands, and Dr. Kim Walvin will speak to that later. And as Michaela spoke about in her presentation, we have the growth and mortality of sargassum that needs to be added to the model. Currently, the model just predicts inert pixels, so there's no growth or mortality data that has been added into the model as yet. And as I said in the results, the wind has been lagged to, the forecasting data was lagged to improve the results, meaning that the wind may be too strong. So we have to look at adjusting the wind added to the forecast to improve the forecasting model. Okay, so yes, thank you. The work was done as part of the Sargassum project. Sarg would have funded some of the beach monitoring.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Do we have any questions from Michaela? Either here in person or online? Okay, Michaela, again, thank you very much for your presentation. So we'll move on now to our second presenter in the second segment, and it's Haibo Zhu, who is looking at improvement of sargassum seaweed tracking in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands using high-resolution FVCOM. Is this an in-person presentation or online? Online, okay, there we go.
Hello, everyone. My name is Haibo Zhu. Today, we're going to discuss a topic, improvement of sargassum seaweed tracking in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands using high-resolution FVCOM. This study was funded by NOAA, titled Caricos Inherent Coastal Intelligence for the U.S. Caribbean. The significant sargassum aggregations in the Central Atlantic Oceans and the Caribbean Sea has been reported since 2011, which has negative effect on the coastal environment and ecosystem. The gas release were leading to healthy problem to people who is traveling and living nearby. The improvements of development of sediment product has been widely used to predict the trajectory and the feet of sargassum in large scale. In addition, high-resolution coastal models such as FVCOM was recently improved and implemented in Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands. which make it possible to track the Sargassum in small scale. So we can take timely actions before Sargassum makes landfalls. In this study, we're going to implement a high-resolution modeling system using AFRICOM in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and validate the performance of the model using a variety of observations. The validated data could provide the more reliable forcing for the particle tracking models. Our preliminary result can be validated by reports from several medias and the local observations. This is unstructured masquerade we're using in Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands domain. The finest resolution is 100 meters close to the shoreline, well up to 3 kilometers in the open oceans. Weather research forecasting model provide us the wind stress and the surface heat flux. It is noted that this model was nested into HICOM, from which the open boundary conditions can be interpolated. I am briefly presenting some validation results. The comparisons between the models and observed data is satisfied. The overperformance of AFRICOM over the existing ocean models such as AMSIS is also demonstrated. These are locations of high concentration of two satellite-derived index, AFAI and MCI, which is present in upper panels and lower panels respectively. This spot can be interpolated as the release locations. More particles are released from the grid with higher concentrations. In order to make you understand what we are doing, I created this workflow. The distribution of index on n space can be used to calculate the numbers of virtual particles, which are tracked by Lagrangian tracking model for a couple of days. The endpoints then compare to the particle distribution derived from index on second day. Unsettled point left from the previous run plus the new points will together continue to the new run. In this method, local grossing and mortality caused by biological terms are predicted. The table 1 presents the Sargassum landforce event recorded for July 2019. We selected 4 of them to study, given the availability of 2 satellite index. The performance of the simulations is quantitative by number of module points over the number of observed points. One example present here is Sargassum simulations at Yalka on July 17th. The particles are tracked 1 day ahead for 24 hours. The endpoints are shown by the black dots, and the red triangle indicates the approximate location of Sargassum landfall. The simulation forced by MCI is more accurately than AFAI, and we can see not only the Yalka Sargassum beaching events is predicted, but the aggregations in the southwestern of Puerto Rico is also surprisingly simulated. This may arise one question: how long in the lead the MCI-derived AFRICOM particle tracking models can be predicted? To answer these questions, we did the following experiments. Sargassum beaching events on July 15 in the eastern Puerto Rico, and on the July 29 in the southern Puerto Rico are studied. The formal study released the particles on the July 13th and simulated for 2 days. The large propagations of endpoints are settled on the shore close to the reported beaching locations. Even on that day, 15th, no MCI index captured by the satellite. In order to validate the effect of reoccurring measure on the accuracy of simulations, we did the side-by-side experiment. We tracked the virtual particles for 5 days with and without MCI index simulations, as shown in the figures in the upper panel and the lower panel respectively. We can see data assimilations makes the accuracy increase significantly. To summarize this work, we are using high-resolution AFRICOM in Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands and a reoccurring technique to minimize the error grossing between the modeled and observed values. The recorded Sargassum beaching events can be accurately predicted by this method with a lead time more than 2 days. This study did not address any effect of wind stress on the trajectory and the feet of Sargassum. However, several studies are reported it is necessary. Therefore, we will introduce the wind forcing into the simulations in the future work. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Haibu. Are there any questions?
Hello, everyone. My name is Haibo Su. Today, we are going to discuss a topic, improvement of Sargassum seaweed tracking.
Okay. He is online. Do we have any questions either here in the room or online for our colleague? I guess we're getting close to lunch, so we're not really having lots of questions now. So we move on to our third presenter, and I'm happy to introduce Kim Baldwin. Having just closed my screen, bear with me, have it right back up very shortly. I'm happy to introduce Kim Baldwin, who is going to speak to us about the Sargassum monitoring protocol with drones, methods for rapidly estimating beached sargassum. Kim?
Thanks, Janice. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be up here. My name is Kim Baldwin. I'm a research associate at Sargassum, but I also am the director of my own company, Marine Spatial Information Solutions. So today I'm going to discuss with you a drone monitoring protocol I've been working on with Hazel Oxenford and many others since 2018, actually. We've been working on this, and excitingly enough, at the beginning of this year, we developed a standardized monitoring protocol, which I am briefly going to talk to you about the journey over the last 4+ years developing it. But unfortunately, I can't teach you the methodology today in 12 minutes. So there is a user's guide, and I'm more than willing to talk to people. And I also do have a virtual training class that you can contact me about if you want to learn some more of the details. So just a background very quickly who I am.
Northwest, southwest, south.
What's going on? Okay, but I'm a fisheries biologist by trade. Many of you know me over the years, GIS and marine spatial planning, creating spatial data is really where my origins and roots are. But what I have realized working in the region that, you know, where we're falling short is building the capacity, or I heard somebody say our digital literacy in the region. So that has where my focus really has been in the last 10 years is looking at emerging technologies, and more importantly, more recently is drone technology in the last 6 years. And how can we leverage those tools to help us create geospatial information, but actually more widespread use and uptake of these technologies as well. So even though I'm talking about Sargassum today, I'm really working in this field under a lot of different environmental management lenses. Oh gosh. Okay, wait, yes, got it. So first of all, why are drones being used for environmental monitoring and management? First of all, I can say just across the board, ease of use, efficiency, and cost are some of the main reasons why people are using drones. Over the last 6 years, I've trained a number of organizations and groups. I'm not going to read the slide, in a variety of different ways using this technology. But today I'm here to talk about Sargassum. But I think before that, we all should, I mean, most of you understand this, but in working in the Caribbean, we have a number of environmental challenges that we face that make it a little more difficult down in the islands to work than other places. First of all, inadequate resources. I'm so sad I can't read my own screen. In terms of money and data, we also are working in extreme environments. The heat, the winds, the humidity is another factor. Also, many of the islands, especially in terms of drone technology, I've had to come up with solutions that you can do fully offline without data. We have limited technological capacity, and as well as GIS capacity. And that's been my bottleneck in the last 15 years is I'm a GIS lecturer. How can we get more people creating and using GIS data? Furthermore, in the Caribbean, we have multiple scales we're working at, as well as multiple levels or audiences of stakeholders. So it's a very exciting and challenging space to be working, especially with drone and geospatial technology. So how can drones be used to support regional sargassum management? So I am not a sargassum expert, but back in 2018, I think Hazel dragged me out on the beach one day to do some beach surveys with her. And I saw what they were doing with buckets, measuring and transects. And I said, Hazel, this is ridiculous. I could fly my drone over this beach and I could tell you 99% what's going on. And sure enough, from then I was roped into this research and I started working with Hazel to figure out how can we do this. I knew conceptually it could happen, but how we could work it all the way through with what I'm going to show you right now. So I was approached at that point in time, and this is the same general workflow that I use for all environmental drone monitoring strategies. So in order to come up with your, to design the workflow, you clearly need to understand your application. What do you want to do with the drones? So I was approached for the Sargassum project by Hazel, and she identified 3 main applications or uses or purposes for the data. The first was for, as you've heard about today, monitoring the abundance or the amount of sargassum washing up onto our beaches. They're also, and again, for the forecasting models, et cetera. There is also people like Patrick McConney and myself and Janice Cumberbatch, and they were interested in using the information for mapping local knowledge of issues, of impacts, of mitigation measures, management effectiveness. And then there was also other people that wanted to use information for collaboration, for education, for outreach, having community discussions, and having an aerial view of what's going on so that you could work with a wider group of people, not just data scientists. So we had identified these as the main applications or end users of the data for the methodology. So as I mentioned, I started the research in 2018 with Hazel and Joseph Weeks. I presented that at the last GCFI we had in person. And at that point in time, we were using drones and trying to figure out, was it possible? Not developing a standardized methodology, but how could drones be used? What are the different ways? So we started researching, and I've done extensive research over the last, what is this, 4 or 5 years, into the various drone survey flight plans, mapping surveys, using pictures, videos, and all the different bells and whistles in these software programs. We also, I'm a scientist, I don't just trust the drone software, that the outputs are indeed valid and true. So I spent, as well as many of the, Michaela has been here with me on the team as well. We spent the last few years measuring and testing the results of the drone photogrammetry and GIS software by actually measuring buckets and seeing, is it true? Is it valid? How accurate are these geospatial tools? And so we've been testing everything as well. I've been working, oh gosh, for years on the GIS analysis, the image classification, using 3D modeling tools in GIS to, interpolate, to create a 3D model of the beach, but understand the volume, and then volume across various classes, whether it was fresh sargassum, semi-old sargassum, which we call the old gold, or the old crispy brown stuff, because there's different entrepreneurs and different uses for the different, I guess you could say, time sensitivity of the landings of the data. And also testing the various automated dashboards that were out there, the various tools out there, because I'm all about keeping it simple. As I know, working for the last 20 years in the region with GIS, we don't have a lot of strong GIS analysts. So that, like I said, was always been my bottleneck. So can we use these off-the-shelf drone tools and re-leverage them in ways to interpolate sargassum? And then lastly, I was very much trying to understand, if we were going to roll this out across the region, how are we going to be able to use and access and share and host this data in a regional way across all the islands? So I ended up choosing, and I tested many different types of drones and drone softwares out there over the years, and I ended up determining for this application that Drone Deploy was one of the best softwares that we could use. Drone Deploy is a drone software that allows you to fly and conduct surveys. It also allows you to process and analyze your data, as well as share it out. And so it's a pre-built commercial tool that's made mainly for construction and agriculture industries, but it is something that's very easy to use. My training classes, in a matter of 5 days, I teach somebody, all types of people, from fishermen to researchers, how to fly a drone, how to conduct and plan mapping surveys, how to process it, as well as how to analyze and create information and export that into a geospatial program, but using just a web-based program, which is Drone Deploy. Also, based on all that research that I did, testing the back end of this, putting it into GIS and cross-validating it, we found that the Drone Deploy and drones photogrammetry software is extremely accurate. It is very non-technical. It has offline, you do not need data to use this functionality. It works with standard DJI drones that you can buy on Amazon. So it's cost effective. It uses cloud-based resources, which means you don't have to have a heavy lifting computer. You don't have to have that centralized storage, and it can be shared out easily to people that are not part of your organization. So that public access is there. Also, it has helped because, as I mentioned, the outputs can be spit either automatically into a GIS program or exported and imported in, the traditional way. So, and then lastly, the benefit is these reporting, I'm going to talk about it a bit, these plugins, these apps, these integrations, and automated reporting tools. It can allow you to create an automated PDF report to summarize your findings. So after I figured out all the different drones, workflows, whatever, at the beginning of this year, the team that I'm working at, the Sargassum team that I work with at Cermes, we developed the standardized monitoring protocol. This is a picture of the user's guide, which is available for download. I have a QR code at the end as well that you can snap to get a copy of this that is very beautifully done by Janelle, one of my research assistants. So what do you need? What do you need to do this protocol? You need Sargassum. All right. You also need to have, we've made this on purpose. It's a very rapid protocol that can be conducted no matter what the abundance is of Sargassum on your beach in under an hour. So you need approximately 2 to 3 people to conduct this survey. You need a drone and a mobile phone or a tablet. And then you use DJI software as well as Drone Deploy. I have to put a plug in that Drone Deploy is given free software to all my Sargassum teams across the Caribbean to process and host this data. So that is a huge contribution by Drone Deploy, and I have to give them extra thanks for that. They've been supporting our research for many years now. So, and then you need a laptop computer to process it and internet. It doesn't have to be the best internet, but as well as Excel. And then we have some field surveys that need to be done. They're very rapid. And it's not just with this Sargassum protocol. I think people think drones go out and do everything for you. Almost all the times with drone monitoring and mapping, you have to also give it some sort of field data in order to make that information useful. So I'm going to discuss what the rapid field survey is that we do for the Sargassum monitoring protocol. So under the Sargadapt project, I just released, or just this summer, developed a 1-month virtual training course. And I'm running it the second time right now under another grant in the overseas territory. And that one was a blended 1 week in person to how to fly and use the drones, but then 1 month virtual to actually learn the protocol and guide the teams as they set up, monitor, create the information, et cetera, and share it out. So we teach them in this class how to plan for the mission, how to select the sites, understand their data needs, set up the field survey extents along the beach, as well as guide them on various apps that they can use to help in the mission planning. The next part of the training class really focuses on conducting the drone surveys. I'm going to talk in a moment about the different types of surveys we conduct every single time we go out. It's not just 1 drone survey. We actually are doing 5. We also train them how to do the beach surveys and the beach monitoring. And then lastly, but definitely not least, training them, and this is my passion, is in data management, data handling, what to do with the data once you collect it, how to assess it, but also how to use the information to summarize and report it. So in our drone monitoring protocol, obviously I can't get into the details, but I'd love to talk about it after if anybody's interested. We actually conduct 5 different surveys, a monitoring base map, which you see the big one. But then after we have our base map of the entire ecosystem, because as I mentioned, there's multiple applications. So the reason why you want to map the whole ecosystem is that when you want to talk to communities about the infrastructure and the social and economic impacts, it's better to have the whole ecosystem. And then when it comes to monitoring the abundance washed up on the beaches, we're using different other flight plans. We're doing something called a corridor plan, which is done more often just along the beach. And then we are also collecting photos, 360 panos, and videos every single time we go out. And the beauty of those is that these pictures are taken with the drone at the same place, the same location, and the same field of view, which makes long-term comparisons and changes over time really useful. The 360 panel is just a great tool, like if you're having a community meeting or you just want to discuss things with people. And all of these are able to be shared on your cell phone or your app. During this class, we trained a total of 51 students in this 1 month, the first cohort, across 21 organizations and 5 different countries. These are just some of the pictures. So during the training protocol, I'm giving you some of the results that came from the students across the various countries. We taught them how to do a site assessment and characterize and classify their various beaches. So you can see an example here from some of the other countries. They chose many beaches that had problems, and then they chose one that they were going to set up and start the drone monitoring protocol. So I guided them over the month in the data collection and handling and analysis. Here's an example from St. Lucia of all the drone surveys that are done. This is Cossenbos Bay, if anybody's been to St. Lucia. So the first step is to do your drone surveys. Step 2, as I mentioned, is you have to do your beach survey. Did I lose power? Oh, what happened? Not me either. So step 2 is the beach survey. Can we read? Oh, I'm over. Okay, well, can I finish it? Oh, okay. Okay. Is that it?
Unfortunately, yes, because you're allowed 12 minutes.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I wish I knew that I saw the time. Okay, well, I only had a couple more slides. Okay, I guess I'll go. Sorry, guys.
Anyway, thank you very much,
Sorry.
Kim. Kim suffers from tremendous enthusiasm, so it's very hard for her to keep to time. It's now my pleasure to, I'm afraid that our next speaker, Paulina Zanella, is not with us. So we're skipping straight to the last 2 speakers, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the other half of the Cermes Sargassum team. So far, you've heard from the biophysical and the digital people, and now we're moving to the social scientists. So without further ado, Janice Cumberbatch and her team are going to speak to us about adaptive capacity in the Eastern Caribbean on Sargassum issues.
Okay, and I'm pointing it at you. All right, good. It's getting a little bit concerned there. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much. And you've heard all the natural physical science, and we're going to bring some social and political perspective to the afternoon. I want to acknowledge my phenomenal team who have pulled together this paper. At the back of the audience is Katrina Hines, who is the project manager for the Sargassum project. Patrick McConney, who you all know, who is on his way back to Barbados right now. Rashida also sitting next to Katrina at the back, who's responsible for the amazing looking slides that we have here. This project is part of the Sargassum project, but we crossed over with our SARTRAC project as well. So I want to acknowledge Emma Tompkins, Jack Corbett, and Sean van der Plank from the University of Southampton. And you will be hearing very shortly from a PhD student, Bethia Thomas, who was responsible for assisting us with a lot of the data processing. The collection of the data in this context was done by our colleagues at CERMI, at Canary. So what are we talking about today? We are looking at adaptive capacity and unpacking governance and adaptive capacity. One of the things that we want to point out is that governance is, oh good, I can see it in front of me. Just realized that, wonderful. So governance generally has certain elements that are essential. And so what we're saying here is that there are appropriate institutional requirements that must be there for adaptive capacity to work. So you need to have assets, obviously. You need to have the flexibility to change. It's called adaptation, flexibility. You have to be able to organize and act collectively. You have to be able to see change and respond to it appropriately as opposed to maladaptively. And you have to also have the agency to know, should we change or should we not change? The problem that we're proposing is that when we look at the universal models of governance, they don't work for small island developing states. So if you look, for instance, at the worldwide governance indicators, which are used by the World Banks, those conceptualizations tend to skew how you would assess vulnerabilities in small states and our ability to adapt. In fact, we go further and we point out that in some instances, things that we use to adapt, they see as negative. So for example, they would say, for example, that you have to avoid certain levels of informality. That's seen as negative. That's seen as corruption and clientelism. But if you operate within a small island developing state, you know, and I know that sometimes that informality is exactly what helps you to function effectively within a governance framework. And so we are making the point that governance in small island developing states has to be understood in its own terms, that size is an essential component of governance, so there is no one size fits all. And we are saying that policymakers actually do make really good adaptations. It's just that the measures don't acknowledge these as good adaptations. So what we did in our study is that we looked at governance in the context of SARGADAP. We went to the 5 countries that are a part of our SARGADAP project: Barbados, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Dominica, and Grenada. And we said, all right, how are you managing? So we've heard the scientists and we've heard about what they're doing, but the people in the offices, the people in the fisheries departments, the people in the tourism organizations, private sector, civil society, how are you coping? What are you doing? We asked them to conduct a self-assessment. So we're taking the self-assessment approach and saying, okay, you tell us how you think you are coping. Our capacity self-assessment looked at 7 thematic components, which I'm listing here now. We looked at policy, legislation, management plans, and networks, of course. We also looked at institutional sargassum risk assessment and adaptation planning, which one might presume you would be doing. We considered their capacity for monitoring, their resources that they had available, how they were coordinating among stakeholders, information and communication sharing, and ultimately how they were monitoring and evaluating what they did. And we did this using a spreadsheet, which we used for them to fill out, and they had to score themselves. So the scoring was fairly straightforward. Once you were able to answer the questions, you gave yourself a score of 0 to 5, but that we didn't end there. You couldn't just say, I score myself a 2, or I score myself a 3, or I give myself a 5. We wanted evidence. So if you scored yourself a 5, you had to give us the evidence to prove that you really did deserve a 5. If you scored yourself really low on a 0 or a 1, we wanted an explanation for why you assessed yourself so low. And then we averaged the scores to all of the questions. So understand that each of the 7 components had a set of questions. We averaged those for each component, and then we had an overall average for the entire test. What did we find out? When we pulled the data together, we then, of course, had to do some statistical analysis of this and some weighting, because we wanted to be able to compare across 5 different countries, and we wanted to be sure that we were, comparing sargassum with sargassum, so to speak. And when we did our work, when we looked at it, every single country without fail scored themselves really, really low in terms of their adaptive capacity with respect to management of sargassum. They did not see themselves as bright stars. Understand that your highest score is 5, and we are seeing scores there that range from 1.04 in Barbados to 0.39 in Dominica, where we got the consistently lowest scores across the 5 countries. When we looked at the scores more closely, where they scored the best or the strongest was under coordination and stakeholder engagement and information and communication, because that gave them the majority of their score. But they were scoring the lowest in monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And I will suggest that, quite frankly, even if we weren't talking about sargassum, these scores could actually be seen if we were assessing management in other areas. MEL is an area that we're really not strong enough on in certainly in these 5 countries. So we looked more closely then at the areas that really popped, and 4 areas definitely jumped out. We had the policy and planning, evidence implementation and evaluation, resource and staffing, and coordination and communication. Those were the ones that really sort of stood out in terms of our analysis. And what were some of the key findings? Consistently, not surprisingly, you're all aware of this, we have no sargassum specific legislation. This is not necessarily a problem because, of course, we have fisheries and other coastal related legislation and policies that we can draw on. But as we progress and we do the type of research that we've been hearing about this morning, I think we have to begin thinking about how we amend and, have addenda to or annexes to our acts and to our guidelines to take into consideration sargassum, especially if we're talking about valorization. Something that does not surprise any of you is the fact that everybody was concerned about the absence of resources, and in specifically the lack of a mandate. Who really is responsible for it? If you have a country where you have a fisheries department, you have an environmental management department, you have a coastal zone management department, you have a tourism department, everybody's being impacted by it. Who's taking responsibility for doing what? And I certainly know that in many of these countries, if we're not clear who takes responsibility for it, then nobody takes responsibility for it, then nothing happens. Again, another surprise, nothing that is surprising to you, the fact that they didn't have enough financial resources to consistently engage in the activities that they needed to engage in, especially pulling together all of the stakeholders from the diverse sectors who are impacted by sargassum. And then there's the idea of informality. In the absence of the budgetary and staffing resources, they had to rely very heavily on informal cooperation on a multifunctional workforce. The very thing that if we follow a typical assessment of governance, you would be told is a no-no. So the very thing that we're told we shouldn't do is exactly what is helping us to work. Now, in planning and policy, there was an average score of 0.82 across the 5 countries. When we look then at the next category that we found of interest, and we look at planning, evidence, implementation, and evaluation, our key findings included the fact that people typically base their decisions on inadequate and patchy evidence about impacts. They did not have real-time data and analysis. And that's why the work that you heard from my colleagues this morning is so critical. We now have to get that into the hands of the people on the ground who are doing the work, the training that Kim does, so that people can actually improve their capacity or their ability to get access to real-time data. They therefore were working with anecdotal assessments and informal evaluation processes. Therefore, they constantly said, we need more resources, we need more resources, we need to be trained, please improve our capacity. We need more Kims, we need more Michaelas, we need more Kazels, we need these people who can help us improve what we're doing. As far as, and the score there was 0.5, so, really very low. As far as the next category was concerned, which was the organizational resourcing and staffing. Sorry, something went wrong there. Yes, I jumped ahead. The score, sorry, for planning was 4.3. The organizational resourcing and staffing, there was the absence of a core budget. How do you expect to get all these cleanups done? How do you expect the monitoring or any of these other things you want to have done if there's no money? Who's going to train? Who's going to procure the equipment? I heard my colleague from the Dutch Islands talking about being able to procure equipment. Lots of people would love to get the equipment that she was talking about. Can we get enough people with the technical knowledge to assist us with what we're doing here? And we will happily take that assistance from outside, recognizing therefore that this is a collaborative initiative and that there's a real need to share what we are learning and doing in any one institution in any one country with our colleagues in other countries and institutions. Here they scored the 0.52. Under communication and coordination, many governments put together task force or committees. They had ad hoc meetings, but they worked reasonably well for as long as they could work, for as long as people could meet and could find the time to meet. There was a lot of informal coordination across sectors, governmental, non-governmental, and it was effective because people have been working for a very long time. When you're in a small island developing states, you know each other, or maybe sometimes you're related to each other. That's how it works. And the lack, though, of a clear communication strategy was a barrier. So to make sure that everybody knew what they were supposed to know at the right time was problematic. But this was where we scored the best. So our informal ties are working for us. What were our lessons? Well, we decided that as far as we're concerned, the relationship between governing capacity and adaptive capacity is not as straightforward. Several challenges exist in, attempting to fulfill the functions that you might have in a large state when you're in a small state with limited budgets. So we rely on informal processes. Size, therefore, is very important. It helps to shape our approaches to governance in ways that are beyond the control of managers, and therefore they rely on what works. So we have submitted the paper to Coastal Management, and we're hoping that we will see it published very shortly. And this final slide acknowledges the funders for both the SARG-ADAPT and the SAR-TRAC projects, without whom we would not have been able to do this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janice. Absolutely on time. We've got 15 seconds left. So if there's a quick question.
It's lunch.
I see no quick questions coming. We've got one other presentation, and I just want to thank you for breaking it down for us and explaining really why nobody wants to take on the challenge of managing Sargassum. Thank you, Janice. Our last speaker is one of our PhD students. She's being judged for the student award, and she's going to talk to us about her PhD, some of her PhD work on communities in St. Lucia coping with Sargassum. Thank you, Bethia Thomas.
Thank you. Pleasant good morning to everyone. I am delighted to be here today to present some of the results of my research at this forum. I am Bethia Thomas, as previously indicated, and it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the presence of my supervisor, Dr. Janice Cumberbatch, my mentor, who you just heard from this afternoon. So I have some big steps to follow in the period just before lunch. I'm looking at a community-based participatory approach to vulnerability analysis for pelagic sargassum in the Eastern Caribbean. And we'll be looking at some results today, composite indicators, drivers, and conceptual frameworks. The outline for my presentation is pretty straightforward, so we will skip that so we can get into the real exciting stuff. In the last decade, the shores of the Caribbean have been inundated with anomalous amounts of pelagic sargassum. This first began in 2011, about 11 years or so ago, and continued in 2014, 2015, but reached unprecedented amounts in 2018. The record-breaking beaching events of 2018 told us that it couldn't be business as usual. We had a real problem on our hands. And so sargassum was now affecting the Caribbean in larger quantities, over a longer duration, and at a greater frequency. And so my research aimed to conduct a participatory vulnerability analysis for 3 rural communities in St. Lucia. And the aim was at the end, we would now have the information to help us develop conceptual frameworks for adaptive management plans that would be best suited for the priorities of the local communities. My research had 5 objectives. The first one, which is the bedrock of this research, was to identify appropriate indicators for the components of vulnerability. Now, for this research, vulnerability is defined as comprising 3 components: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, where exposure and sensitivity act to increase vulnerability, while adaptive capacity would reduce vulnerability. We also looked at a participatory approach because we believe that communities are not homogeneous, and persons are best placed to describe their vulnerability as they are the ones that live with it every day. And we looked at St. Lucia because, as it lies at the heart of the archipelago, it received large influxes of sargassum. It is also a small island developing state from which we could have used and drawn other inferences. And of course, I am St. Lucian, so you understand the natural bias. So objective 1 was to look at, or to identify to identify appropriate indicators that would define the components of vulnerability, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. We would then use these indicators to create a composite vulnerability index that would define that vulnerability. These indicators would then be used to explain the drivers of vulnerability, and we would look at the environmental indicators, economic indicators, and social indicators. The 4th objective of my research is what I enjoy doing the best, and you will hear a little bit more about it, and I have dubbed it the voice of the invisible. And finally, this all came together by developing conceptual frameworks for adaptive management plans for sargassum influxes in St. Lucia. So for those of you who do not know where St. Lucia is, we lie south of Martinique and north of St. Vincent and northwest of Barbados. The 3 communities that were part of this survey was Dennery, Praslin, that should read Praslin, and Micoud. They are all located along the east coast of St. Lucia because this is the coastline that is affected by sargassum influx. It was only in 2018 when the entire island was affected. Of course, there were far more sites. However, using a matrix, we were able to narrow it down to the top 3 sites. You would appreciate that research is time-bound, and with limited resources, we could only focus on 3. For this research, we used a mixed methodology where we blended quantitative approaches with qualitative approaches. Under quantitative approaches, we conducted extensive household surveys that we supplemented with census data. And that was used to create our composite indicators, our composite index. Under qualitative, we looked at key informant interviews with policymakers and our managers. We also did our focus group meetings with our fisher folk, and we had the voice of the invisible, where we allowed persons who would not normally be involved in management to give a voice. And so we had the women, we had the youth, we had disabled, we had the Rastafarians, minority groups, the poor. And so they came together using their voice and their words to create participatory videos, one of which you will see tonight at Cinefish. And so the qualitative methodologies contextualize the numbers we saw and explain the story behind the numbers. And so we were able to identify 18, yes, this is where the number 18 comes in, 18 indicators for the 3 components of vulnerability, 6 for exposure, 4 for sensitivity, and 8 for adaptive capacity. And we were able to put these in various categories. Of course, time would not permit me to go through each one of them, but I'm happy to explain to you why we selected them. Of course, we use the 3 R's: robust, relevant, and representative. For this research, we used or adapted a very unconventional methodology, the multidimensional poverty index. And you might ask, why poverty? I'd be happy to tell you. You see, poverty and vulnerability, though they're intricately linked, they're not synonymous, they're not the same. While all poor people are vulnerable, not all vulnerable people are poor. Nevertheless, they are caused by similar factors, and so coming together, we were able to draw meaningful inferences from this methodology. Additionally, the MPI is a very useful tool that allows us to examine the proportion of people in a given population that experience multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. It uses 2 measurements, one called the head count ratio, represented with a capital H, where it looks at the incidence of vulnerability. Here we look at the people who are, the average number of people who are at risk in a population. The next measurement is the average risk share among the vulnerable, or the intensity of vulnerability. And here it tells you the average number of risks that each vulnerable person would experience. And so we adapted this methodology. We adapted it in terminology, in the dimensions, in the categories, in the scale at which it was used, in the first cutoff, in the second cutoff, and we kept the underlying principle the same, where MVI, multidimensional vulnerability index, is calculated as a product of the incidence of vulnerability times the intensity of the vulnerability, or H times A. And you would get a value that ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 is not vulnerable at all and 1 is completely vulnerable. And so for our results, it was interesting to note that Dennery scored a value of 0.27. Praslin was the most affected of 0.44, and Micoud 0.29. The vulnerability for Praslin fell within the medium range, while the ones for Dennery and Micoud fell within the low to medium range. Additionally, there are a few important trends we observed. We noted that Praslin scored the highest percentage for vulnerability in most of the indicators, such as damage to property and household appliances, poor social cohesion, inadequate coping strategy, and no participation in capacity building related to Sargassum. Additionally, Dennery scored the highest in 3 of those indicators: health implications, loss and reduction of the beach, and limited understanding of Sargassum. Micoud, on the other hand, also scored the highest in 3, including unemployment, and of course, no economic survival and social security, closely related to that, and a very low percentage of persons who had completed a secondary school level of education. All 3 communities indicated that they had no knowledge of the existing draft Sargassum management plan and limited information on alternative uses of Sargassum. Now, the third objective looked at developing drivers. Now, we know drivers, or driving forces as they are called, are the ultimate causes of a hazard. And so as drivers change a system, they can influence its response to a hazard, to any hazard. And so we were interested in looking at what the drivers will for the specific communities. Now, drivers can be natural or human-induced, they could be direct or indirect, but we know that they influence the hazard. Now, due to time constraints, I'm only able to show you the one for Dennery because it's the one you will view the video on later. And so we identified our drivers, the types: environmental, economic, and social. Then we came up with the categories of the drivers, and then we looked at the drivers themselves. Would be interesting to look at all three, as you would later see, or in future talks, that the ones for Prale were quite different, although it is situated between, it is much smaller in size, smaller in population, a different topography. However, it would be far more vulnerable had the people not been so resilient in diversifying into CMOS farming. And of course, we ended our research by using the indicators that we had to develop conceptual frameworks. And essentially, the indicators were prioritized: low, medium, and high. The medium and high indicators were used to develop the drivers, and the drivers in turn were used to influence the conceptual framework. I must tell you that this research, this framework, was developed with the community. So it's the community persons, the key informant interviews, the fisher folk, led by myself, that came up with this. And you'll be amazed what the community can do when the people came together. And so they came up with this very elaborate conceptual framework, which begins with a few assessments. You could see they began with a socioeconomic assessment. They also have a CAP survey and a vulnerability assessment. Of course, all three may not be required, or they may be used in combination. And then these assessments would then present the needs of the community. And having identified the needs of the community, we can now draft a management plan that would help meet those needs. And the final part of the flow chart looks at the results of those strategies in the management plan. This is a nice flow chart which ends with monitoring and evaluation. And of course, so we'd see what is working, what is not working, how can we change this to the betterment of the community. What we have learned in this process is that community members, despite their vulnerability, are able to be actively involved in Sargassum management, as they are the ones that live with it every day. We've also learned that they're very interested in training and capacity building, and they continue to seek financial and research assistance for alternative uses of Sargassum. And we have those, of course, who are saying, you know what, Sargassum is here to stay, and there's nothing we can do about it. Let's just live with it. So with that, I thank you for your time. I still have about 1 minute for questions, but this is before lunch, so I'm not anticipating any. And of course, this would not be possible without the assistance of those wonderful people, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Bethia. You kept well to time, and it was a very, very interesting analysis of your communities. You're not going to escape the questions, because if you're going for a student award, you have to answer questions. So somebody out there better ask some. There's so much. Thank you. I see questions already. Nancy.
So that last slide you showed with all of the stuff on it that people are, yeah, which will take like half an hour to, to actually be able to figure out. So that is actually what the community and the fishers, they came up with all those things, and you just sort of helped them put it together in a flow chart organization.
Yes, so, right. So we held a series of community meetings where they came up with we used the problem and solution tree method, and they used that methodology to come up with their participatory video that you will see later. Additionally, we invited them back to a stakeholder validation and scenario planning workshop. There we used a representative of the group, so we couldn't invite all 30 community members back. So we invited the policymakers, we invited the head of the fisheries cooperative, we invited 1 or 2 fisher folk, and of course it was led by myself. And they would not have all the technical terms. So they may say to you, we want to better understand Sargassum. How do we frame that? And I would tell them, maybe you can call it a communication strategy. And we come up with the pretty terms, and they'd say they want to flow, and we move things around. And yeah, they came up. You'd be interested to see what the other folks came up with. And what I've really learned is sometimes as scientists and researchers, we think that all the answers reside with us, but it's quite the contrary, that persons are able to really take charge of Sargassum management or any hazard management in the community.
Thank you. It was a really neat presentation.
Thank you. That was one professor.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And your whole mantra of giving voice to the invisible has been lovely, and being a part of the community that you studied is really powerful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just want to thank everybody for staying the course. It's fantastic to see such a huge live audience. It's so exciting after staring at a Zoom screen for the last 2 years. It's lovely to see people moving around and actually not sleeping. And I hope you've enjoyed the session. I think we're back on time, so enjoy your lunch.